Hey there, and welcome back. If you are getting comfortable now, perhaps with the lights low and something warm and cozy nearby, then settle in, because tonight's story is one of those that I have been wanting to tell for a long time. It is a love story. This is a love that lasts a lifetime, one many of us could only dream of ever having. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from and what time is it for you. And if you enjoy these journeys through history, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. If you leave a comment, just know that I read and reply to every single one I receive. I genuinely love meeting the people who spend these evenings here together, whether you're here to drift into sleep or to follow the currents of history. I'm glad you're with me. It is in some ways the most famous love story of the 19th century, and yet the version that has come down to us through the costume dramas and the museum gift shops has tended to flatten it into something neater and less interesting than what it actually was. Tonight we are going to spend some time with Victoria and Albert, not the figures on the postage stamps, not the bronze statues outside the Royal Albert Hall, not the marble effigies at Frogmore. The two young people. The cousins who barely noticed each other at 17, who fell in love at 20 in the space of about 5 days, who married in February of 1840, who built a life and 9 children, and a partnership across 21 years, who were separated by his death at 42 from typhoid fever in December of 1861, and who continued, and this is the part that I find genuinely astonishing about this story, to be married, in her mind, for the next 40 years of her widowhood, until her own death in January of 1901. That is the full arc. From their first meeting in May of 1836, when they were both 17 and neither of them was impressed with the other, to her death 64 years later with his photograph in her hand and his dressing gown folded into her coffin. And what I want to do tonight is walk that whole road with you slowly in the unhurried way that this story really deserves, because the version that gets told in 15-second documentary clips is missing almost everything that makes it interesting. Here is what I find most genuinely interesting about this love story before we begin. We are used to the idea that royal marriages of the 19th century were dynastic arrangements first and marriages second. The cousins were paired up by uncles and grandmothers and ambassadors. The young woman was told who she would marry. The young man was told he would be useful. The wedding happened. The succession was secured. The personal feelings of the people involved were at best a bonus and at worst an inconvenience that everyone politely ignored. That is the standard pattern of European royal marriages from that era, and the Victoria and Albert marriage was, in its origins, exactly this kind of arrangement. Their uncle Leopold, the King of the Belgians, had been engineering it since they were children. The grandmother who wanted it most, the Duchess of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, had been mentioning it in letters since 1821, when both of the children were toddlers. The political logic was clear. The dynastic logic was clear. The marriage had been, in some sense, planned for them before either of them had any say in the matter. What is genuinely remarkable, and what makes this story different from nearly every other royal marriage of the 19th century, is that the planned dynastic match turned, at the moment of the second meeting in October of 1839, into one of the most passionate, devoted, and personally transformative love affairs of the entire Victorian period. The arrangement became a love story. The dynastic obligation became a marriage that both of them, by every surviving piece of evidence, would have chosen even if no one had been pushing them toward it. The transformation is the thing that I want you to understand tonight. How a planned cousin marriage between two reasonably indifferent 17-year-olds became, at 20, the sort of love that produced a 40-year widowhood when one half of it was taken away. How the political arrangement worked against every reasonable expectation as well as it did, and what the marriage actually meant to the two people who were inside it day by day through the 21 years that they had together. Before we begin, let me set the two of them in front of you properly, because the Victoria and Albert who walk into this story in 1836 are not the figures we tend to picture. The Victoria of the famous portraits in Widow's Black, sceptre in hand, the imperious matriarch of the empire, that is the Victoria of the 1880s and 1890s, 4 decades after Albert is dead, and the Albert of the standard reference, the impossibly handsome prince consort with the sideburns and the serious expression, that is the Albert of his later 30s, after 20 years of overwork and care, had carved his face into the gravity that the photographs preserve. The two of them at 17, in May of 1836, are different, younger, less defined. The shapes of the people they would become are still being arranged. Victoria in May of 1836 is a small, slight, intense young woman of 17. She will turn 17 on the 24th of that month. She is just under 5 feet tall. She has light brown hair, blue eyes, and the protruding lower lip that the Hanoverian bloodline has been passing down for a century and that she will never quite grow out of. She has been raised in what historians have come to call the Kensington System, the elaborate, suffocating, jealously controlled regime that her mother, the Duchess of Kent, and her mother's controller, Sir John Conroy, have constructed around her since infancy. She has not slept in a room alone in her life. She has not walked down a staircase without holding someone's hand. She has not spoken to a strange adult without supervision. She has been kept for 17 years in the deliberate isolation that her mother and Conroy believed would make her, when she became queen, dependent on them. What this regime has produced, against its intended design, is a young woman of considerable interior strength and considerable interior frustration. She knows she is going to be queen. The current king, William IV, is 69 years old and ill, and she is his heir. The succession is clear. She has been preparing for this, in her way, for years. She is intelligent. She is conscientious. She has been keeping a daily journal since she was 13, and will keep one until the last week of her life. And the journal is one of the most thorough first-person records of any monarch in history. She is also, at 17, longing for an adult life of her own, longing for an end to the Kensington System, longing for the freedom that becoming queen will, she has been told, finally bring her. What she is not longing for, in May of 1836, is a husband. Marriage has been discussed, of course. She is a princess and an heir, and discussions about her future husband have been going on since she was a child. But the prospect of marriage as a personal reality, rather than as a distant political abstraction, is something she is in no hurry to encounter. She likes her independence. She values it. She has heard from various sources that her uncle Leopold and her grandmother in Coburg are very keen on the idea of her marrying her cousin Albert, and she is, at 17, mildly resistant to the idea precisely because they are so keen on it. This is the Victoria who, in May of 1836, is about to meet Albert for the first time. Albert, on the other side of the equation, is also 17 3 months younger than Victoria. He was born on the 26th of August 1819 at Schloss Rosenau, a ducal castle near Coburg in central Germany. He is, by every contemporary account, a strikingly handsome young man, tall, slim, blue-eyed, with the type of regular features that the romantic novels of its time had been training young women to find irresistible. He is also, by the same contemporary accounts, serious, scholarly, somewhat shy in social settings, and prone to a melancholy that runs in the family and that will deepen across his life. His childhood has been, in its own way, as difficult as Victoria's. His parents' marriage was a public disaster. His mother, Louise of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg, had married his father at 16 and had been miserable from the start. His father, Duke Ernst I, had been an unfaithful husband on a scale that the German court could not absorb. Louise had eventually taken a lover of her own. There had been a scandal. She had been banished from Coburg in 1824, when Albert was 4. Albert and his older brother Ernst had been raised by their father and their grandmothers, with Louise removed from their lives entirely. Louise had died of cancer in 1831, when Albert was 12, without ever having seen her sons again. Albert had not, by every account, recovered from this. He had idealized the mother he barely remembered. He had developed a deep, lifelong distrust of female sexual unfaithfulness, of marital scandal, of a form of wreckage that adult passions could produce. He had decided, somewhere in his early teens, that his own marriage would be the opposite of his parents' marriage, that it would be steady, faithful, dignified, careful, and the foundation of a stable family life rather than the source of endless chaos. This decision had become one of the central architectural facts of his interior life. He had been educated, with his brother Ernst, by tutors of high quality, principally a man named Christoph Florschutz, who had been with them since they were boys. The education had been thorough: German classical, music, philosophy, history, science, languages, the works. Albert was, at 17, considerably more educated than Victoria, who had received the patchy and unsystematic schooling of an English princess of her period. He was also more reflective, more melancholy, more given to thought, and considerably less interested in the pleasures of dancing and society than Victoria was. He had been told since he was a child that he was likely to marry his cousin Victoria. He had absorbed this information without much enthusiasm. He had not met her. He had heard vaguely that she was lively and pretty. He had also heard, from his uncle Leopold and various others, that he was being prepared for the role of her husband, and that this was understood to be his vocation in life. He had accepted this, in the dutiful way of a younger son of a German duchy who had no other obvious career, and who took family obligations seriously, but he had not at 17 fallen in love with the abstract idea of his cousin as Leopold, and the grandmother had perhaps hoped. This is the Albert who in May of 1836 is about to travel from Coburg to London to meet Victoria for the first time. Both of them are 17, and neither of them at this stage has any strong feelings about this prospect one way or the other. The first meeting is going to be, in its way, one of the most thoroughly recorded non-events in royal romantic history. Before we get to it, let me give you a little more of the texture of the lives that the two of them were leading up to this point, because the difficulty of their childhoods is part of why the eventual marriage produced what it did. Victoria's childhood at Kensington Palace had been, by every account that has survived, a suffocating version of the difficult childhood that royal children then were generally given. The Kensington System, as historians have come to call it, was the elaborate set of rules and arrangements that her mother and Sir John Conroy had constructed to manage every aspect of her upbringing. The motives behind the system were partly political. Her mother and Conroy hoped that by keeping Victoria isolated and dependent, they would secure their own positions of influence when she became queen. The motives were also partly protective. Victoria's three predecessors on the throne were her three uncles, and the unsuitable lives those uncles had led, and the various scandals that had followed them across their adult years had given her mother a clear sense that the next monarch needed to be raised differently. The system was designed to prevent Victoria from becoming a version of monarch the four sons of George III had been. The system was thorough. Victoria slept in her mother's bedroom every night until she became queen, in a bed beside the larger bed of the Duchess. She was never alone, even for a few minutes during the day. A governess or a lady-in-waiting was with her at every meal, every lesson, every hour of recreation. She walked downstairs holding the hand of an adult, on the theory that she might fall otherwise. She was kept apart from other children of her own age and station. She had no real friends of her own choosing, and the few children she was permitted to see were carefully selected by her mother and Conroy. She was educated at home by tutors whose curriculum was approved by the Duchess and Conroy, and who reported back to them on every aspect of her progress. She was permitted to read only books that had been approved. She was permitted to receive only correspondence that had been screened. The whole texture of her daily life was in how the system had been designed to produce, controlled at every point by the two adults who had constructed the system around her. The result, by the time Victoria was 16 and 17, was a young woman of considerable interior strength who had developed her own resistance to the system. She kept her thoughts to herself. She wrote in her journal in a way that she could not be observed. She developed, in the space available to her, a will of her own. She formed strong loyalties to the few adults who treated her with genuine affection: her governess Baroness Letzen, her music master, her drawing master, her uncle Leopold, who wrote her long letters from Belgium. She was, by 17, quietly and thoroughly preparing to assert her independence the moment she became queen. This is the young woman who met Albert in May of 1836. The 17-year-old who had never spent a night alone, never walked downstairs without an adult's hand, never had a friend of her own choosing. The 17-year-old whose access to ordinary social pleasures, the dancing, the late nights, the talking with cousins, had been so restricted that when she was given a few weeks of relative freedom during the Coburg cousins' visit, she threw herself into the available pleasures with the appetite of someone who had been kept hungry. The complaint that Albert made about her wanting to dance until 2 in the morning is, when you understand the Kensington system, less a complaint about a flighty young woman than a clue to how starved the 17-year-old Victoria had been for the ordinary social life of her age and class. Albert's childhood, on the other side, had been difficult in different ways. The Coburg court was small by the standards of the great European royal courts. The Duchy of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, later, after some territorial arrangements, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, was one of the dozens of German states that the Holy Roman Empire and its successor arrangements had produced, and the resources of the ducal household were modest. Albert grew up not in the great state palaces of a major monarchy, but in the comfortable but ducal residences of Coburg-Rosenau and the various other ducal properties scattered over the territory. The court he knew as a child was a court of perhaps 30 or 40 people. The world he grew up in was geographically Coburg town, the surrounding countryside, the various ducal properties, the social network of related minor German nobility. What this German childhood gave Albert was a set of qualities that he carried into adulthood and into his marriage. He was in the way of someone raised in a place, attentive to detail. He noticed things. He had been brought up in close daily contact with the people around him, the tutors, the few servants, the cast of his daily life, in a way that the children of larger courts were not. He had been given a thorough European education, partly to compensate for the smallness of the Coburg world, and the education had taken, he had emerged from his years with Florschutz and his year at Bonn as one of the best educated young princes in Europe. He was musical. He drew well. He read widely in several languages. He had thought, seriously, about the character of life he wanted to lead and about the shape of man he wanted to be. The shadow over his childhood had been the broken marriage of his parents. The detail of that breakdown is worth understanding, because it shaped Albert's whole approach to his own marriage in ways that are not always recognized. His father, Duke Ernst I, had been a man of conventional ducal vices. He drank, he gambled, he kept mistresses, he spent more money than the duchy could afford on his various pleasures. His mother, Louise, had been 16 when she married Duke Ernst, who was 33. The match had been a financial salvation for Ernst, who needed Louise's inheritance, and an affectionate beginning that had quickly soured under the pressure of Ernst's continuing infidelities. Louise had borne 2 sons, Ernst, the future duke, in 1818, Albert in 1819, and had then, by about 1821 or 1822, given up on the marriage. She had taken a lover of her own, an army officer named Alexander von Hanstein, and had been openly involved with him for several years before the household scandal forced a separation in 1824. The settlement was harsh. Louise was banished from Coburg. She was forbidden contact with her children. She was given an allowance and an ordered residence in Paris, away from any place where she might encounter the boys. The boys were kept with their father and their grandmothers, and were told only the most general things about why their mother had gone away. Albert was 4 when she left. He never saw her again. She died of cancer in 1831 in Paris when Albert was 12, having spent her last 7 years separated from her sons by the arrangements of the family. The effect on Albert was significant and lifelong. He idealized the mother he barely remembered. He associated her, in some way, with the childhood happiness that had ended when she went away. He developed in his teenage years a horror of marital infidelity and a determination that his own future marriage would be unlike his parents' marriage in every respect that he could control. Faithful, steady, public in its devotion, in its strength, the sort of marriage in which the 2 parties supported each other around the long working days of an adult life, rather than tearing each other apart through the chaotic adult passions that he had seen destroy his own family. This is the young man who arrived at Kensington Palace in May of 1836 to meet his cousin Victoria for the first time. The 17-year-old who had decided, in the logic of a teenage boy who had grown up watching the wreckage of his parents' marriage, that his own marriage would be the redemptive opposite of theirs. The 17-year-old who had been told that his cousin Victoria was likely to be his wife, and who had absorbed this information not as a romantic prospect, but as a vocation, the vocation of being the faithful husband who would build the marriage he himself had not had as a child. Both of them were 17. Both of them had been shaped in different ways by difficulties that had given them qualities the other would eventually recognize. Neither of them, in the spring of 1836, had any clear sense of what that meant. The first meeting, when they finally got to it, would not produce the answer. Albert and his older brother Ernst arrived in London in mid-May of 1836, at the invitation of Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, who was Albert's father's sister, and who was as committed as her brother Leopold to the project of bringing the cousins together. The visit had been arranged carefully. The official cover was a routine family visit, two German princes coming to call on their English aunt and cousin because European royal cousins called on each other constantly along the 19th century. The actual purpose was the inspection. Albert was being shown to Victoria, and Victoria Albert, in the considered hope that the two of them would find each other agreeable, and that the dynastic plan that the older generation had been refining since they were children might begin to move toward execution. Neither of them was told this directly. Both of them understood it perfectly. Victoria received Albert and Ernst at Kensington Palace on the 18th of May. She was, in her own words from the journal entry of that evening, pleased with both of them. Ernst struck her as cheerful and good-natured. Albert struck her as handsome. Handsome, she noted in the journal that his eyes were beautiful, and that his nose and mouth were very fine. The cousins spent the evening together. There was a family dinner. There was conversation. There was, in the way of these things, the mutual inspection that the older generation had organized the visit to produce. What Victoria did not feel on the 18th of May or throughout the following weeks of the visit was anything like romantic love. She liked Albert. She thought him handsome. She found him pleasant company. She also found him somewhat too serious for her taste, somewhat too inclined to leave parties early, somewhat too reluctant to dance for the long hours that Victoria at 17 considered essential to the proper enjoyment of an evening. He was a perfectly nice cousin. He was not in any romantic sense the answer to a question that she had not, at 17, asked. Albert's reaction to Victoria on his side was similarly tepid. He found her lively and pretty enough. He found her also, by his own accounts, somewhat too fond of late nights, too fond of dancing, too fond of the type of society pleasures that Albert, even at 17, considered superficial. He wrote to his stepmother at one point during the visit complaining about how exhausted he was. Victoria had wanted to dance until 2 in the morning, and Albert had wanted to be in bed by 10, and the gap between their preferred bedtimes had been one of the central practical strains of the visit. He was a serious young German, used to early hours and evenings. She was a young Englishwoman who had been kept on a short leash by her mother for 17 years, and who, when allowed access to a ballroom, intended to make the most of it. The visit lasted about 4 weeks. Albert and Ernst left in mid-June. Victoria's journal entries record the parting as friendly, affectionate in a cousinly way, without any suggestion that anything more had passed between her and Albert than between her and Ernst. She was, at 17, fond of both of them. She was not at 17 in love with either of them. This is the part of the story that I find most genuinely interesting, because it cuts against the way we tend to mythologize the great love stories of history. We want the moment of recognition. We want the lightning bolt at the first encounter, the look in the room, the immediate and irreversible knowledge that this is the person. The Victoria and Albert version of this moment did not happen in 1836. They met. They got along reasonably. They parted as friendly cousins. The future that Leopold and the grandmother had been planning for them was, in the spring of 1836, no closer to happening than it had been before the visit. What we tend to mistake, looking back, is the difference between a planned dynastic match and an actual love affair. The plan was in place. The love affair was not. The two would not become the same thing for another 3.5 years, and the transformation when it came would surprise both of them. Albert returned to Germany after the 1836 visit and resumed his education. He was sent, in 1837, to the University of Bonn for a year of study with his brother Ernst, where he applied himself, in the diligent way that was characteristic of him, to law, history, philosophy, music, and the modern languages. He was a good student. He was popular with his fellow students in a serious young German way. He was at this stage being shaped by his uncle Leopold and his old tutor Florschutz into a form of educated, cultivated, broadly prepared young prince that they considered necessary for the role they had in mind for him. He worked hard. He took his future seriously. He did not, in the records that survive from this period, spend a great deal of time pining over his English cousin. Victoria, meanwhile, was about to have her life transformed in a way that would change the question of her marriage from a distant abstraction into an urgent practical problem. On the 20th of June 1837, at 6 o'clock in the morning, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain arrived at Kensington Palace and knocked on the door. King William IV had died at Windsor at 12 minutes past 2 that morning. They had ridden through the night to bring the news. Victoria, 18 years and 27 days old, was awakened by her mother and went down in her dressing gown to the sitting room where the two officials waited. They knelt. They kissed her hand. They informed her that she was now Queen Victoria's journal entry for that morning is one of the great documents of her life. She wrote that she would do her duty. She wrote that she felt, despite her youth, prepared for the responsibility that had fallen on her. She wrote that she had asked, on her first morning as Queen, to be left alone for an hour to think, the first hour she had ever spent alone in her life. After 18 years of the Kensington System, she wrote, in the entry, the Declaration of Independence that the morning permitted, she moved from Kensington to Buckingham Palace within 3 weeks. She removed her mother from her immediate household, sending the Duchess of Kent to a separate suite of apartments, and gradually distancing herself from the woman who had controlled her childhood. She removed Sir John Conroy from her court entirely, in the first move of an 18-year-old asserting her independence from the people who had been managing her life. She began the process of being queen. She was good at it, in unexpected ways. She had a manner. She had a clear sense of duty. She had absorbed through the years of preparation more about the workings of the British Constitution than her detractors had expected. Her first Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, fell into a kind of fond paternal mentorship of the young Queen, and the early months of her reign were dominated by the daily long meetings with Melbourne, in which the elderly Whig statesman taught the young Queen the practical work of being a constitutional monarch in a parliamentary system. She listened. She learned. She wrote down, in her journal, what he had told her each day. She came to admire him deeply. She came also, as lonely young people sometimes come to do, to half fall in love with him, in the platonic way of an 18-year-old, whose only male company is a 60-year-old statesman of unusual charm. This is the period of the Queen's life when the question of her marriage became for the first time an urgent political question rather than a distant family abstraction. She was 18. She was unmarried. The succession depended on her producing an heir. The political stability of the kingdom depended on the succession. Pressure began to mount from every direction on the question of when she would marry and to whom. She resisted. The journal entries from 1837 and 1838 are full of her resistance. She did not want to marry. She liked her independence. She liked her work. She liked her long afternoon rides and her evenings with Melbourne and the freedom from her mother that becoming queen had finally brought her. The idea of taking a husband, of giving up some portion of the autonomy she had only just acquired, was something she contemplated with reluctance. She was, in the famous diary entry from this period, against the prospect of marriage in any near future, The Coburg uncles and the German grandmother, of course, kept the pressure up. Leopold wrote regularly, in his Uncle King way, reminding Victoria of the suitability of Albert and of the family's hopes. Albert was kept available, his education continuing under the assumption that the marriage would eventually happen, his life on hold while the question of when Victoria would change her mind remained open. He was, in the honest accounting, in a difficult position. He was being prepared for a role that depended on Victoria's eventual willingness to marry him, and Victoria's willingness was, across 1837 and 1838, and most of 1839, distinctly absent. The pressure on Victoria to marry came to a head in the summer of 1839, in the wake of two political crises that had genuinely shaken her. The first was the Lady Flora Hastings affair, a cruel scandal involving a lady-in-waiting whom Victoria's circle had wrongly accused of being pregnant, who had been subjected to a humiliating medical examination, who had been demonstrated to be not pregnant, but in fact mortally ill with a tumour, and who had died in July of 1839, with the public blaming the Queen and her household for the cruelty of the affair. The second was the bedchamber crisis of May 1839, in which the Queen's refusal to dismiss her Whig ladies in waiting on the demand of the incoming Tory government had brought down Sir Robert Peel's attempt to form a government and had forced the recall of Melbourne. Both crises had damaged the Queen's standing. Both had revealed the difficulty of her position as a young unmarried woman managing a court and a government largely composed of older men who did not entirely trust her judgment. Both of these crises matter for our story because of what they did to Victoria's interior sense of her own position. The Lady Flora affair was, by the fact that her journal recorded it, the first major moral failure of her reign. She had, at the centre of the matter, behaved with the unfairness of a young woman who had trusted the wrong advisers, and the consequences of that unfairness had been a woman's death and the public's withdrawal of affection. The bedchamber crisis was, in the constitutional way that her advisers had explained to her afterwards, a moment when she had been unable to manage the political demands of her position without the support of someone she trusted, and the inability had cost her, at least temporarily, the affection of a substantial portion of the political class. Both crises had been, by the summer of 1839, working their way into her sense of her own loneliness and her own inadequacy to the position she was holding. She was 20 years old. She was the queen of the most powerful kingdom in the world. She was, through how the crises had revealed, alone in a way that the structure of her life had not prepared her for. This is in some sense the answer to the question of why she fell so completely in love with Albert in October of 1839, when she had been so reluctant to consider him in 1837 and 1838. The 2 years of difficult queenship had done their work. The Lady Flora affair and the bedchamber crisis had shown her that she needed someone beside her, in a way that she had not previously needed anyone. The proposition of having Albert as a husband had moved, in her interior accounting, from a constraint on her independence to a relief from her isolation. When she saw him on the staircase on the 10th of October 1839, she was ready, in a way that she had not been ready in 1836, to find him irresistible. By the autumn of 1839, Victoria had begun, slowly and reluctantly, to reconsider the marriage question. She was still not enthusiastic about the idea. She was still, in her journal entries, using the same language of hesitation and resistance that she had been using for 2 years. But she was, in the way of a young woman beginning to register the practical realities of her position, no longer entirely against the prospect. She agreed. after considerable correspondence with Leopold, that Albert and Ernst could come to England again for another visit. She agreed, with reservations, to look at Albert one more time and consider whether her view of him had changed. This visit was scheduled for October of 1839. Albert was, by this point, 20 years old. He had been told, with a clarity that the 1836 visit had lacked, that this visit would essentially decide the question, that if Victoria did not, on this second meeting, find him sufficiently appealing to marry, the dynastic plan would have to be abandoned, and he would have to find another role in life. He travelled to England in the autumn of 1839 in a state of considerable anxiety about the outcome. What happened next is one of the great moments of 19th century European history. 5 days. 5 days to fall in love. 5 days from the awkward, anxious arrival of an uncertain young man at Windsor Castle to the moment when the Queen of the United Kingdom proposed marriage to him in her sitting room. Let us look at those 5 days carefully, because they are remarkable. Albert and Ernst arrived at Windsor Castle on the 10th of October 1839. Victoria had been given advance notice that they would arrive that day, but the precise hour had not been confirmed, and she was still working through her morning correspondence when the message came that the carriages were approaching. She went to the top of the great staircase to receive them. The journal entry that she wrote that evening has become one of the most quoted passages in royal biography. She wrote that Albert was beautiful. She wrote that he was excessively handsome. She wrote in the underlined emphasis that her journal entries used for the things she felt strongly about, that his eyes were exquisite, that his moustache was slight, that his figure was broad in the shoulders and narrow in the waist. She wrote that her heart, in the phrase, was quite going. The young man at the top of the staircase was, somehow, no longer the tepid cousin of 3 years earlier. He had grown. He had finished his education. He had become, over the 3 intervening years, the man rather than the boy. And Victoria, looking down at him from the top of the staircase, was, where her journal recorded, struck. This is the moment that everyone who tells this story stops at. The staircase. The Queen seeing the cousin she had not properly seen before. The lightning bolt that had not arrived in 1836 arriving with full force in the autumn of 1839. The story tends to skip from this moment directly to the proposal 5 days later, as if the falling in love had been instantaneous and the rest of the visit had been a formality. The actual 5 days are more interesting than this. Let me walk through them. The 10th of October, the day of arrival, was the staircase moment and a long evening of dinner and conversation in which Victoria revised her 3-year-old impression of Albert around the course of perhaps 4 hours. He was, she discovered, no longer the serious German boy who had wanted to leave parties early. He had, somehow, acquired an ease, a confidence, a presence that he had not had at 17. He was 20 now. He had been studying at Bonn. He had been travelling. He had been thinking, with seriousness, about what kind of man he wanted to be. The result, walking up the staircase at Windsor on the 10th of October 1839, was a young man considerably more compelling than the young man Victoria had said goodbye to in 1836. The 11th and 12th of October were the days of the accumulating recognition. Victoria spent considerable time with Albert and Ernst across these 2 days, riding in the morning, walking in the gardens in the afternoon, dining together in the evening, dancing in the evening parties she arranged. The journal entries from these 2 days record her growing attachment in the incremental way that her journal recorded everything she was thinking. He was kind. He was thoughtful. He was attentive to her in a way that was neither too forward nor too distant. He danced well, better than he had at 17, when his reluctance to dance had been one of her chief complaints. He talked well on subjects that interested her. He laughed at her jokes. He looked at her in how the journal recorded, in a way that suggested he was finding her at least as interesting as she was finding him. The 13th of October was the day of the decision. Victoria, by her own later accounts, made up her mind on the evening of the 13th that she was going to marry Albert. She did not yet tell anyone. She made the decision in the way of a 20-year-old woman who had been resisting marriage for 2 years and who had now, in the space of 3 days, been overturned. She wrote in her journal. She thought through the practical implications. She slept on it. The 14th of October was the day of the preparation. She informed Lord Melbourne, in her morning meeting with him, that she had made up her mind. Melbourne, who had known about the plan for years, and who had been quietly supportive of it without pressing her, was relieved and pleased. He gave her the practical advice she would need, that as Queen she would have to make the proposal herself, since no man under her was permitted to propose marriage to her. Victoria absorbed this information with the steadiness. She absorbed all advice from Melbourne. She agreed that she would propose to Albert the next day. The 15th of October 1839 was the day of the proposal. Victoria summoned Albert to her sitting room at Windsor Castle at about 12:30 in the afternoon. He came. She had, by her own later account in the journal, prepared a speech, and she delivered it in the way she had prepared. She told him that he must already have guessed why she had asked him to come. She told him that it would make her too happy if he would consent to what she wished. She told him, in the direct words that the moment required, that she was asking him to marry her. Albert, by every account that survives, accepted with considerable warmth. He embraced her. He told her, in his German-accented English, that he would be very happy to spend his life with her. The two of them sat in the sitting room for some time, in the way of a couple who had just become engaged and who needed a few minutes to register what had happened. They embraced again. They said the things that newly engaged couples say. Victoria's journal entry for that afternoon is one of the most touchingly straightforward she ever wrote. She described it as the brightest, happiest moment of her life, and she described Albert in the repeated phrase she used so often about him in this period as her dearest, dearest beloved. Let me sit with the proposal scene for a moment, because there is something genuinely remarkable about the gender dynamics of it that the standard accounts tend to glide past. The constitutional position of a reigning queen in 1839 was a peculiar one, and the question of how a reigning queen would conduct courtship and marriage was at the time of Victoria's accession essentially without precedent in English history. There had been queens regnant before. Mary I, Elizabeth I, Mary II, but none of them had married after coming to the throne as Victoria was about to do. Mary Tudor had married Philip of Spain after her accession, but that had been a fully political match arranged by the council. Elizabeth had famously not married. Mary II had married William of Orange before either of them was sovereign. Anne had married Prince George of Denmark before her accession. None of them provided a working precedent for what Victoria was about to do: propose marriage as the reigning monarch to a foreign prince of equal rank but of no political standing in her kingdom. The constitutional logic that Lord Melbourne had explained to Victoria was, when you consider it carefully, extraordinary. As the reigning sovereign, Victoria was technically the source of all honours, all titles, all preferments in her kingdom. Any man, including a foreign prince, who was permitted to marry her was in some constitutional sense being granted that permission as a piece of royal favour. He could not propose to her because to do so would be to ask her to confer on him a royal favour without her having indicated her willingness to confer it. He had to wait for her to indicate, through her proposal, that she was offering him the honour of marriage to the sovereign. The proposal was not merely a romantic act, it was a constitutional act, a piece of royal will being exercised in how the constitution required. Victoria, on the 15th of October 1839, exercised this royal will. She summoned Albert. She told him what she wanted. She asked him whether he would consent. He consented. The constitutional formality was completed. The dynastic question that had been in suspension since they were children was now, because the proposal had resolved, answered. The fascinating thing about this is the contrast between the constitutional formality of the proposal and the personal warmth of what had actually happened in those 5 days. Victoria had not, in any practical sense, exercised a calculated royal will. She had fallen, in 5 days, into a version of love that 20-year-olds fall into, in a way that her 2 years of reluctance had not prepared her for. The proposal had been, on paper, a constitutional act. In her experience of it, it had been the thing that her own emotional life had pushed her into doing. The two of them, the constitutional formality and the personal warmth, had aligned by the 15th of October in a way that neither Victoria nor anyone around her would have predicted at the start of October. The arrangements that the older generation had been making for 15 years had, against every reasonable expectation, produced not just a dynastic match, but an actual love affair. Let me also tell you what she wrote to Albert in her first letter to him, after he left Windsor at the end of October to return briefly to Coburg, because the register of these early engagement letters is worth attending to. She wrote that she could hardly believe what had happened. She wrote that she felt as if she were dreaming. She wrote that she missed him so terribly that she could hardly bear to write the letter, and that she was constantly looking up from her desk to where he had been sitting beside her, and that the absence of him in the room was like a physical pain. She wrote that she loved him more than she could say. She wrote that he was her angel, her dear angel, the precious one who had been given to her by Providence, and whom she would treasure for the rest of her life. These letters of October and November 1839 are, in the arc of the relationship, the high pure note of the early love. The young woman who had been resisting marriage for 2 years was now, with the complete reversal that 20-year-olds are capable of, in a state of total infatuation with the man she was going to marry. She had no reservations. She had no second thoughts. She had only, in the register that her letters maintained along the 4 months of the engagement, the increasing feeling that she had been astonishingly fortunate in the husband she had chosen, and that the rest of her life was going to be different and better because of him. Albert, on his side, wrote letters that were but more measured. He had not, in the same way, fallen completely. He had accepted Victoria with affection and with the sense that she was the woman he was going to marry. He had not, in the honest accounting of his correspondence, been overwhelmed by the fact that Victoria had been overwhelmed. The asymmetry of the early feelings, Victoria entirely in love, Albert affectionate but more reserved, was a feature of the engagement period that historians have noted with some interest. It would persist in modified forms throughout the early years of the marriage. The asymmetry would gradually dissolve as Albert's affection for Victoria deepened in the working years of the partnership into something that matched her devotion to him. But in the autumn of 1839 and the winter of 1839-40, the relationship was, in its emotional weighting, more Victoria's than Albert's. The engagement was, in the strict diplomatic sense, kept for a few weeks while the practical arrangements began to be made. Victoria informed her Privy Council on the 23rd of November. The announcement was made public shortly after. The wedding was scheduled for the 10th of February 1840, less than 4 months from the proposal. There was a great deal to do. The 4 months between the proposal and the wedding were, for both of them, a strange and consequential interval. Albert went back to Coburg in mid-November to put his affairs in order, to take his leave of his father and his brother, and the German childhood he was about to leave behind permanently. Victoria stayed in England, sending him a stream of letters in her hand, full of endearments and household arrangements, and the daily news of the court. She missed him acutely. She wrote, in the repeated phrasing that her letters of this period used, that she could hardly bear to be apart from him. She also, in the honest way that her surviving correspondence shows, made a number of decisions during these 4 months that would shape the early years of the marriage in ways that Albert had not entirely anticipated. She decided against Albert's wishes that he would not be permitted to choose his own household. His English staff would be selected by her advisers rather than by him. She decided against Albert's request that he would not be given a peerage, that he would remain Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha rather than being made an English duke. She decided, against the pressure from Albert and from Leopold, that he would not be granted a substantial allowance from Parliament. The 50,000 annual sum that Leopold had received as a similar consort years earlier was, in the political climate of 1840, reduced to 30,000 by an unfriendly House of Commons, and Victoria did not press for the larger figure. These decisions were not made out of cruelty. They were made out of Victoria's 20-year-old understanding of her own constitutional position, in which her husband would be her husband but would not, on any account, be permitted to share her sovereignty. She loved Albert. She also intended, with considerable firmness, to remain queen in her own right. The two principals, devoted wife and absolute sovereign, would coexist through the marriage in a tension that Albert would spend the next 20 years carefully working through, and the early decisions about his role and his allowance and his household were the first signs that the working through was going to be more difficult than either of them had imagined. Albert, for his part, accepted these arrangements with the patience that was characteristic of him. He did not protest publicly. He did not, in his letters to Victoria, push hard against decisions she had clearly already made. He took his leave of Coburg in early February of 1840, travelled to England with his father and his brother, arrived at Buckingham Palace on the 8th of February, 2 days before the wedding. He went with Victoria to Windsor on the 9th, in the final visit before the ceremony. The wedding took place on Monday, the 10th of February 1840, at the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace. The day had begun early. Victoria had risen at about 8:45 in the morning at Buckingham Palace, having slept badly over the previous night with the natural anxieties of a young woman about to be married. She had breakfasted with her mother, in one of the few moments of warmth between them around the difficult years since the Kensington System had been dismantled. She had dressed slowly along the morning, with her ladies attending through how the wedding morning toilet required. The dress, the lace, the jewels, the hair, the preparation of the bride that had been the subject of weeks of anticipation, was assembled across about 2 hours. She had written briefly to Albert in the morning. The note that survives is short and direct. She wrote that she hoped he had slept well and was well, and that the rain that was falling outside would not be too unpleasant. She wrote that she was, in the formulation of her writing, his ever-loving, faithful Victoria. The note was carried across to Albert at the room where he was preparing in the same palace. The procession from Buckingham Palace to St. James's Palace was made in the carriages of the royal household. The route ran down the Mall and along the Pall Mall stretch into the courtyard at St. James's. The crowds along the route had been gathering since dawn, despite the wet weather. By the time Victoria's carriage moved down the Mall at about midday, perhaps 100,000 people were standing in the rain along the route, in the way of London crowds turning out for a royal occasion. Victoria was visible through the carriage windows. She waved. The crowds cheered. The wet morning was by every account transformed into something genuinely by the affection of the people lining the route. The Chapel Royal at St. James's is, as I mentioned earlier, a church. The ceiling is the famous Holbein ceiling from the early 16th century, painted by Holbein himself with the armorial designs of the Tudor court. The interior is lined with dark panelling and dark pews. The altar is at the east end, raised by 3 steps. The space is intimate. The acoustic is close. The whole building has, where the Tudor royal chapels have, the feeling of a family chapel rather than of a great public church. Victoria entered the chapel at about 1 o'clock. The Archbishop of Canterbury was waiting at the altar. Albert was waiting at the altar steps in his red Field Marshal's uniform, with the various decorations of the Order of the Garter and the Coburg orders that he was entitled to. The bridesmaids, 12 of them in their matching white dresses, followed Victoria up the aisle. The peers and other distinguished guests were arrayed in the pews. The Duchess of Kent was in the front pew on Victoria's side. The members of the royal family who were available, Victoria's various uncles and aunts and cousins, were arranged in the precedent that the Lord Chamberlain had organised. The ceremony itself followed the standard form of the Anglican wedding service of the age. The Archbishop asked the questions of intent. Victoria and Albert gave the answers. The vows were exchanged. The Archbishop pronounced them husband and wife. The choir sang. The guests rose. Victoria and Albert moved into the chapel for the signing of the register, in the formal completion of the legal marriage. Throughout the next hour they processed back from St. James's to Buckingham Palace. They were, by this point, married. They were also, by every account of those who watched them on the procession back, visibly happy in a way that the strain of the morning had not quite permitted before the ceremony. Victoria was smiling. Albert was smiling. They were holding hands in the carriage, in the gesture that the carriage windows just made visible to the crowds along the route. It was, for the period, an unusually intimate royal wedding. The Chapel Royal is a church, perhaps 120 people could fit in it comfortably, and the guest list was kept relatively short by the standards of the great state weddings of the era. Victoria, in a piece of self-presentation that would echo through every English wedding for the next 2 centuries, wore a white satin gown rather than the heavily coloured and gold-embroidered robes that had been the standard royal wedding dress until then. The decision to wear white was deliberate. White was associated, in 1840, with the ordinary middle-class bride rather than with royal pageantry. Victoria was, in the symbolic gesture, presenting herself as a wife rather than as a state, a young woman marrying the man she loved, in the colours of an ordinary bride, in the intimate ceremony that the Chapel Royal permitted. The dress itself was made of white Spitalfields silk satin, with a deep flounce of Honiton lace at the hem, and a Honiton lace veil. She wore a wreath of orange blossom rather than a tiara. She carried a bouquet of orange blossom and myrtle. Her bridesmaids, 12 of them, in white dresses to match her own, followed her up the aisle. The whole effect was deliberately less imperial and more domestic than the wedding of a queen would normally have produced, and the visual decisions she made that morning would be copied by ordinary brides across Britain and eventually in the Western world for the rest of the 19th century and into the 20th. The white wedding dress as we know it is, in some real sense Victoria's invention. Albert wore the uniform of a British field marshal, the office to which he had just been appointed. The Archbishop of Canterbury performed the ceremony. The vows were exchanged in the standard form. Victoria pledged to obey, which in her case was, in the joke that everyone in the chapel must have registered, an interesting promise from a sovereign queen to her consort. The ring was placed on her finger. The wedding was solemnized. They walked back down the aisle together as husband and wife. The wedding breakfast at Buckingham Palace was a relatively brief affair. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Victoria and Albert had departed in a carriage for Windsor Castle, where they would spend their honeymoon, a remarkably brief honeymoon by the standards from the period, only 3 days, because Victoria had insisted that she could not be away from her duties for longer. He had wanted, in the wish of a young husband, to spend a full week or two alone with his new wife away from the pressures of the court. Victoria had been firm. 3 days was what the duties of the Queen permitted. 3 days was what the honeymoon would be. The wedding night when they reached Windsor that evening is one of the set pieces of 19th century royal romantic history. Victoria's journal entry for the night of the 10th of February is, by the standards of 19th century journal entries, extraordinarily expressive. She wrote that she had never spent such an evening. She wrote that Albert's love and tenderness was beyond what she could ever have imagined. She wrote, as the journal recorded the moments she most wanted to remember, that the night had been a perfect dream of love. The Victorian discretion of the time period prevents us from knowing more than this. What we can know from the journal entries of the days that followed is that the wedding night and the brief Windsor honeymoon went well, that the early intimacy of the marriage was a source of considerable mutual happiness, and that Victoria emerged from her first 3 days as a married woman in a state of considerable satisfaction with the choice she had made. The marriage that began at the Chapel Royal on the 10th of February 1840 would last for 21 years and 10 months, until Albert's death at Windsor on the 14th of December 1861. Across those 21 years, the marriage would produce 9 children, would transform the British monarchy, would establish a model of domestic royal life that would shape royal families across Europe for the next century, and would form the central organising fact of Victoria's adult existence. It would also, in the early years, be considerably more difficult than the wedding night entry suggests. The two of them had a great deal to work out. Let me walk you through the first years of the marriage, because the difficulties of those early years are essential to understanding why the love between them deepened the way it did. The first major difficulty of the marriage was the question of Albert's role. He arrived in England in February of 1840 as the husband of the Queen, with no clear definition of what that position actually entailed. He was not a king consort, in how a male queen might in some periods have been. He was not a constitutional officer with defined functions. He was, in the initial arrangement, a foreign prince who had married the sovereign and who was expected, in the absence of any defined role, to occupy himself with whatever his wife and her advisers deemed appropriate. What this meant in practice, through the first 6 months of the marriage, was that Albert had almost nothing to do. Victoria worked through her boxes of state papers each morning. She met with Lord Melbourne. She received ambassadors. She conducted in the daily way the working business of the British monarchy. Albert sat in an adjoining room, or in his study, or in the gardens, and waited for her to be free to spend time with him. He read. He took up the piano and the violin, and played for hours at a stretch. He attended to his correspondence. He went for long walks. He attempted, in the way of an intelligent and active young man, to find something useful to occupy his time. The problem, as he wrote in a letter to a friend in Germany about 3 months into the marriage, was that he was not, in any practical sense, master in his own house. The house was Victoria's, the court was Victoria's, the household staff was Victoria's, the political business that occupied her days was Victoria's. He was, in the formulation of the letter, only the husband and not the master. He had married the Queen of the United Kingdom, and United Kingdom had married him without ceasing, in any particular, to be the Queen. This was, for a young man who had been raised to expect a meaningful role in life, genuinely difficult. Albert had not, by every account, married Victoria expecting to be merely her decorative spouse. He had expected, because his Coburg upbringing and Leopold's tutelage had prepared him for, to be a working partner in the marriage and the monarchy. The first months made clear that the working partnership would not be granted to him automatically. It would have to be earned, slowly, in the negotiations that the marriage would conduct across its first decade. The first opening came, paradoxically, from Victoria's first pregnancy. She conceived almost immediately after the wedding, a fact that historians have tended to handle with the discretion that the topic requires, but which is plainly visible in the dating of the first child. Princess Victoria, the future Empress of Germany, was born on the 21st of November, 1840, 9 months and 11 days after the wedding. Victoria had not been enthusiastic about the prospect of pregnancy by the fact that her journal records she had hoped, through how 20-year-old new wives sometimes hope, that the consequences of marriage would arrive at a time of her choosing rather than the very first month. But the pregnancy was confirmed by April, and from April through November of 1840, Victoria was increasingly unable to perform the full range of her queenly duties. This was the opening that Albert needed. As Victoria's pregnancy advanced, he gradually took over, with her permission, an increasing share of the daily administrative work of the monarchy. He read the state papers with her. He helped her draft replies. He sat in on her meetings with Melbourne. He learned, with the systematic application that was characteristic of him, the practical work of being a constitutional monarch in the British system. By the time their first child was born in November of 1840, Albert had, in the way of an accumulator of useful skills, made himself genuinely necessary to the working of the Queen's office. There was also the matter of the assassination attempt in June of 1840, which is one of the set pieces of the early marriage and which deserves to be mentioned because of what it reveals about the relationship. On the 10th of June 1840, Victoria and Albert were riding in an open carriage up Constitution Hill toward Hyde Park, in the daily afternoon drive that the Queen took for fresh air. A young man named Edward Oxford, a 19-year-old former barman with delusions of political grandeur and a pair of pistols, stepped out from the path beside the road and fired at the carriage. Both shots missed. The first shot whizzed past the heads of Victoria and Albert. Oxford was then seized by passers-by and taken into custody. What is interesting about this incident, for our purposes, is what Albert did. He had, in the fraction of a second between the first shot and the second, pulled Victoria down into the carriage and covered her body with his own, in the instinctive protective gesture of a young husband whose wife was being shot at. The whole incident lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Victoria emerged from it physically unhurt and emotionally shaken. Albert emerged from it having demonstrated, in the irreversible way that crisis demonstrates such things, that he was prepared to put his body between his wife and a bullet. Victoria, in the journal entry she wrote that evening, registered what had happened. She was deeply moved by Albert's response. She wrote that he had been her brave protector. She wrote, in the formulation that the entry recorded, that she had married a man who would die for her. The marriage that had been struggling across its first 4 months with the question of Albert's role and Victoria's reluctance to share her sovereignty was, after Constitution Hill, a different marriage. Albert had earned by his protective response a piece of standing in Victoria's eyes that no amount of administrative work would have produced. He was, after the assassination attempt, her husband in a deeper sense than he had been before it. The combination of the protective response in June and Albert's competent help across her advancing pregnancy through the autumn produced, by the time Princess Victoria was born in November, a substantial shift in the working balance of the marriage. Albert was, by the end of 1840, a meaningful working partner in the queenship. The shift was slow, careful, never explicitly negotiated, but it was real. Over the next several years, the shift would deepen, where the marriage's daily working arrangements continued to evolve. The first child was born without serious complication. Victoria, like most royal mothers belonging to that world, did not nurse the baby herself. A wet nurse was engaged in the standard arrangement of the era, and Victoria's recovery from the birth was reasonably steady. The baby, named Victoria after her mother, but called Vicky in the family, was the first of the 9 children that the marriage would produce. Let me pause here for a moment and talk about the children, because the production of 9 children around the next 17 years is a central fact of the marriage, and one that needs to be addressed honestly. Victoria did not enjoy pregnancy. She did not enjoy childbirth. She found pregnancy physically unpleasant, the births painful and frightening, the period of recovery from each birth extended and exhausting. She found babies less interesting than older children. She found, in the way her letters from this period reveal, the accumulation of pregnancies along the early years of the marriage genuinely difficult to bear. She had, in some fashion that the surviving correspondence reveals, expected to have perhaps 2 or 3 children. She had not expected 9. The reason there were 9, despite Victoria's lack of enthusiasm for the process, is that contraception in the 1840s and 1850s was essentially unavailable to a married couple of her station. In 1841, physically intimate. The intimacy produced pregnancies. The pregnancies produced children. There were 9 of them throughout the 17 years from 1840 to 1857. The 9 were in chronological order: Vicky in 1840, Bertie in 1857. Each birth was difficult for Victoria in its own way. The early births were physically traumatic, as all 19th century childbirth tended to be, with no anesthesia and no real medical understanding of what to do if anything went wrong. The middle births were complicated by what we would now recognize as postnatal depression. Victoria suffered, after several of the births, from periods of low mood, irritability and difficulty managing her duties that the modern reader will recognize as a serious clinical condition. The later births brought the additional anxiety that came with discovering, after the birth of Leopold in 1853, that Victoria was a carrier of haemophilia. Leopold's condition revealed it, and the genetic legacy that Victoria had inadvertently brought into the European royal families would, in the next century, result in the haemophilia that affected Russian, Spanish and German royal descendants, and that played a role in some of the great political tragedies of the 20th century. What is worth saying about Victoria's 9 children, in the honest way that this account requires, is that the production of them was, for her, a duty rather than a pleasure. She loved her children. She was, in her own way, a devoted mother. But the pregnancies and the births were a price she paid for the marriage rather than a joy of it, and the journal entries from this period make this clear without apology. The popular image of Victoria as the matriarch surrounded by her children, taking obvious pleasure in domestic family life, is largely a myth assembled by Albert and the court for public relations purposes through the 1840s and 1850s. The reality of Victoria as a mother was more ambivalent and more privately reluctant than the public image would suggest. Albert, by contrast, was a deeply involved and enthusiastic father. He took genuine pleasure in the children in a way that Victoria mostly did not. He played with them. He educated them. He designed their schedules and their lessons. He was, in the way of a man who had himself been raised in the chaos of his parents' broken marriage, determined to give his own children the involved fatherhood that his own father had not given him. The children, the older ones, came to know Albert as the more present and more involved of the two parents, and Victoria as the more distant and more demanding one. This dynamic would have consequences over the marriage and beyond it, and would shape Victoria's relationships with her adult children, with Bertie, the heir, whose difficult character and difficult relationship with his mother would be one of the frustrations of her widowhood. The early years of the marriage were also the years in which Victoria and Albert built the homes that would become central to their family life. The London palaces, Buckingham Palace and St James's, were inherited working royal residences, and neither of them was suited to the character of domestic family life that Victoria and Albert were trying to construct. They wanted, in the joint project that occupied much of the 1840s, places of their own, places where the children could grow up away from the formality of the London court, places where they could be in how the public image was trying to project a family rather than a public institution. Each of the 9 children deserves at least a brief introduction here, because they were the working production of the marriage, and because the relationships Victoria and Albert had with each of them was different and revealing. Vicky, the eldest, born in November of 1840, was Albert's companion across her childhood. She was bright, quick, and intellectually capable, in a way that drew Albert into her education from her earliest years. He taught her German, French, history, philosophy. By the time she was a teenager, she was, because their relationship had built up across her childhood, his closest intellectual companion in the family. When she married Frederick of Prussia and went to Berlin in 1858, Albert lost his most important interlocutor, and the gap she left was, by his own accounting in his letters, the ache of his last 3 years. Bertie, born in 1841, was the heir, and was by every account of his childhood a different sort of boy from Vicky. He was less intellectually capable, more inclined to physical pleasures, less willing to apply himself to the rigorous educational program that Albert had designed for him. The educational program was, in retrospect, almost cruelly intense. 12 hours a day of structured study, no free time, no friends of his own choosing, the systematic production of the perfect royal heir according to Albert's principles. Bertie did not thrive under it. He resisted by the fact that a not particularly bright boy will resist an educational program designed for a much more capable child. The result, by the time he reached his 20s, was a young man who was permanently somewhat at odds with both his parents, and who would carry a residue of that conflict into his eventual reign as Edward VII, Alice, born in 1843, was the practical and capable daughter who emerged in the family's working life as the reliable presence. She nursed Albert across his last illness in December of 1861, with a devotion that everyone in the family remarked on. She married Louis of Hesse in 1862. She died of diphtheria in 1878 at the age of 35, after nursing her own children through the same illness, in one of the grievous family losses that Victoria had to absorb around the widowhood. Alfred, born in 1844, went to sea as a Royal Navy officer at the age of 14 and spent most of his adult life in the Navy. Helena, born in 1846, was the plain middle daughter who married a German prince and settled into a life of charitable work. Louise, born in 1848, was the artistic daughter who became a sculptor and who married, in the unconventional way that she preferred, a British nobleman rather than a foreign royal. Arthur, born in 1850, became a soldier and eventually Governor-General of Canada. Leopold, born in 1853, was the haemophiliac son whose medical condition shadowed the rest of his short life and who died at 30 in 1884. Beatrice, born in 1857, was the youngest child and was, in the way of last children, kept close to her mother. Victoria essentially refused after Albert's death to let her marry and leave the household, and Beatrice eventually married only on the condition that she and her husband would live with Victoria. Beatrice's husband, Henry of Battenberg, died young in 1896, and Beatrice was the daughter who lived with Victoria along the last years of the widowhood and who attended her at her death. Each of these 9 children carried in their adult lives some piece of the marriage that produced them. The European royal families of the late 19th and early 20th centuries were dominated, by the time of Victoria's death, by her descendants Wilhelm in Germany, Alex in Russia, the various other grandchildren scattered throughout the various German and Greek and Romanian and Norwegian and Spanish royal houses. The intermarriages in the European royalty from that era meant that, by the early 20th century, almost every reigning house in Europe had a Victoria and Albert grandchild in it somewhere. The political consequences of this, the family connections that crossed the great geopolitical divisions of its time, the correspondence between cousins on opposing sides of the great alliances, would be one of the features of European diplomacy through the half-century after Victoria's death, and would be tested with disastrous consequences in the family disagreements that preceded the First World War in 1914. The first home of their own was Osborne House, on the Isle of Wight. Albert had long been thinking that the family needed a retreat away from London, and in 1845 he and Victoria purchased the existing estate at Osborne, on the northern coast of the Isle of Wight, with their own money rather than from the public purse. Albert then proceeded, with the architect Thomas Cubitt, to demolish the existing house and design a new one from scratch, in the Italianate villa style that Albert had admired during his time in Italy. The new Osborne House was completed in stages between 1845 and 1851. It was Albert's project from start to finish. He selected the site, designed the layout with Cubitt, chose the materials, planned the gardens, supervised the construction. What Osborne represented for Albert and Victoria was the first physical embodiment of the shape of family life they wanted to have. It had a wing for the family that was separated from the staff quarters and the official rooms in a way that no royal residence had previously achieved. It had a children's wing where the 9 children, as they arrived, would have their own apartments and schoolrooms. It had a beach where the family could swim. Albert designed a bathing machine for Victoria, the wheeled wooden hut that would be rolled into the sea so that the Queen could bathe in privacy through how the period required. It had gardens that Albert designed personally, with the orchard and the kitchen garden where the children grew their own vegetables in the plots that Albert had laid out for them, each child having his or her own plot and the wheelbarrow and set of tools that was sized for a child's use. The Swiss cottage, built in the gardens of Osborne in 1853 and 1854, was Albert's project for the children's education. It was a full-sized chalet, in the Swiss style, in which the children could play at being adults. There was a kitchen where the girls learned to cook, a workshop where the boys learned carpentry, a museum room where they collected the natural history specimens they found on the estate. Albert's idea was that the children should have practical skills as well as academic ones, that they should learn to do useful work with their hands, that they should grow up understanding the labour of an ordinary household rather than only the formal life of a court. The Swiss cottage was, in some sense, an experimental laboratory for a kind of royal childhood that no royal children had had before. It still stands at Osborne. You can visit it. The kitchen and the workshop and the museum room are still there. The second home of their own was Balmoral, in the Scottish Highlands, which they leased in 1848 and bought outright in 1852. Balmoral was even more thoroughly Albert's project than Osborne had been. He demolished the existing castle in 1853 and designed a new one in the Scottish baronial style, with the systematic attention to detail that he applied to everything. The new Balmoral castle was completed in 1856. It was, for Victoria and Albert, the most beloved of all their homes. They went there each autumn, for several weeks at a time, in the annual ritual that the family observed over the rest of Albert's life. The Highland setting, the hills, the rivers, the relationships with the local Scottish staff produced in Victoria a depth of attachment to Scotland that would last for the rest of her life, and that would in her widowhood shape some of the more controversial decisions of her later years. The Christmas traditions that Albert imported into the British royal family around the 1840s deserve a mention here, because they have shaped the way British and American Christmases have been celebrated ever since. Albert brought from Germany the custom of the Christmas tree, not the tabletop arrangements that had occasionally appeared in earlier English Christmases, but the full floor-to-ceiling decorated fir tree that was standard in the German Christmas of his childhood. He set up trees at Windsor and at Buckingham Palace each December, decorated with candles and ornaments and wrapped gifts and sugar figures. He arranged the family Christmas around the tree in the way of the German family Christmas. The gifts on Christmas Eve rather than on Christmas Day, the tree as the centrepiece of the evening, the family rituals that he had brought from Coburg. What gave these traditions their broader cultural reach was an engraving published in the Illustrated London News in December of 1848, showing Victoria and Albert and the children gathered around the Christmas tree at Windsor. The engraving was widely circulated. It established, for the British public, the image of the Christmas tree as the centrepiece of family Christmas. Within a decade, Christmas trees had become standard in middle-class British households. Within a generation, they had spread to America, where the Pennsylvania German tradition that had already existed in some communities was reinforced by the British example into the standard American Christmas tree. The Christmas tree as we know it along the English-speaking world is, in some real sense, a Coburg tradition that Albert imported and that the engraving of 1848 popularized. This is the sort of thing that Albert did throughout the 1840s and 1850s, and that gradually transformed the British monarchy, and through it, the broader culture of the English-speaking world, in ways that few people realized at the time, and that fewer still recognize now. The Christmas tree, the white wedding dress, the model of the royal family as a private domestic unit, rather than as a public institution, the attention to art and architecture and music and education, the systematic transformation of the royal household from a court of the 18th century kind into a working household of the 19th century kind. All of this was Albert's project, and the working partnership with Victoria in the 21 years made it possible. Let me pause here and describe the daily working life of the marriage during the years of its mature partnership, because the texture of that daily life is the part of the story that the public narrative tends to skip over, and that in some real sense, is the love story. A typical working day in the marriage of Victoria and Albert through the late 1840s and 1850s ran roughly as follows. They rose at about 7 in the morning. They breakfasted together in the private dining room next to their bedroom on the simple breakfast that Albert preferred: coffee, bread, butter, occasionally eggs, occasionally fruit. They read the newspapers together at the breakfast table, exchanging comments about the news. They retired to their separate workrooms at about 8:30. Victoria's workroom was the room where she met her ministers and where the daily dispatch boxes were brought to her. The dispatch boxes were the physical fact of 19th century constitutional monarchy leather boxes, sealed, brought daily by messenger from the various government departments, containing the papers that the Queen was required to read, sign and return. The volume of paper was substantial. A Prime Minister's box could contain 50 or 60 separate documents. A Foreign Secretary's box could contain even more. Victoria worked through the boxes each morning in the way she had learned from Melbourne, reading every paper, signing where signature was required, sending the boxes back over the next 24 hours. The work was time-consuming. It required her continuous attention. Albert had his own workroom next to Victoria's. Around the late 1840s and into the 1850s, his role evolved gradually from advisor to working partner to de facto private secretary. By the early 1850s, he was sitting beside her as she worked through her boxes, helping her draft replies, organizing her correspondence, screening the routine matters from the urgent ones. They worked side by side for perhaps 3 to 4 hours each morning, in the collaborative way that the partnership had refined to. He would, at intervals, get up and walk to his own desk to work on his own correspondence. She would, at intervals, summon a minister or a secretary for a brief consultation. They were, across these morning hours, working together, where any well-functioning office of two intelligent people works together, in the collaboration that has become so practiced that the two people involved no longer need to discuss what each is doing. They lunched together at 1 o'clock in the private dining room. Lunch was simple. They were joined often by 1 or 2 of the older children who had been studying in the schoolroom along the morning and who came down for lunch. The conversation was about the day's work, the children's lessons, the household business, the news. The lunch was brief, perhaps half an hour, and was followed by the afternoon work. The afternoon was generally less concentrated than the morning. Victoria would receive ministers, sometimes for long meetings, sometimes for brief audiences. She would receive ambassadors. She would receive the stream of visitors that the Queen of the United Kingdom was required to receive across her working days. Albert would attend to his own portfolios, the royal commissions he chaired, the various educational and charitable boards he presided over, the architectural and design projects that occupied his attention. They might meet in the late afternoon when there was a question Victoria wanted Albert's view on, or when Albert had something he needed to discuss with her about the household or the children. In the late afternoon they tried, when the weather permitted, to walk or ride together. The walks at Windsor in the Great Park, the rides throughout the heath at Osborne, the afternoon drives at Balmoral, these were the daily intervals of physical exercise and outdoor air that both of them required for their well-being. Victoria was fond of riding and rode well into her late 30s, until the difficulties of the later pregnancies and the accumulating weight that the pregnancies left behind made her give it up. Albert was a good rider and a walker, and continued to ride and walk in the whole of the marriage. The afternoon hour or two of physical exercise, often together, was one of the pleasures of the working day. They returned to the house in the late afternoon and changed for dinner. Dinner was at 8 o'clock at the larger residences when company was present, and at 7 o'clock when the family was alone. The dinner was the formal centre of the day's social life guests, conversation, the production of the royal evening that the household had refined over the years. After dinner, the company removed to the drawing rooms where Albert often played the piano or the organ, where Victoria would sometimes sing along, where the musical evenings of the family were one of the reliable pleasures of the household. The company would withdraw at about 11. Victoria and Albert would go to their bedroom. They would talk for a while about the day. They would write briefly in their journals. Victoria at length, Albert in the summary form that his own journal-keeping took. They would say their prayers. They would go to sleep. This is the daily working life of the marriage at its mature peak. There is nothing dramatic in it. The day is a working day. The work is continuous. The shared time within the day, the breakfast, the morning side-by-side work, the lunch, the afternoon walk, the evening music, the bedtime conversation is constant but unspectacular. It is the accumulating texture of a partnership that had become so completely integrated into the daily routines of two people that the two of them could no longer easily imagine what their lives would be like without the other. This integration is the part of the love story that the popular versions tend to lose. We want, in our love stories, the dramatic moments, the staircase, the proposal, the wedding night, the deathbed. The actual love is mostly in the accumulating texture between those moments. The breakfasts, the morning work, the shared comments on the news, the walks in the late afternoon, the music in the evening, the 1,000 daily contacts of two people whose lives have become so intertwined that they constitute, in some real sense, a single working organism with two heads. When Albert died, what Victoria lost was not, in the first instance, the staircase moment or the proposal or the wedding day. She lost the breakfast. She lost the morning work beside her. She lost the lunch and the afternoon walk and the evening music and the bedtime conversation. She lost the daily texture that 21 years of marriage had built up into the ground of her adult life. The widowhood rituals, the preserved rooms, the laid-out clothes, the plaster hand, were in some real sense an attempt to preserve that daily texture, to keep alive in the household the physical reminders of the partnership that had been built through the working days. The peak of the working partnership, and the moment that historians have generally identified as the high point of the marriage, was the Great Exhibition of 1851. The Great Exhibition was Albert's project from start to finish. He had been talking, since 1849, about the idea of a great international exhibition of arts and industry, a vast public display of the manufactured and natural and artistic achievements of the world's nations, gathered in one place for public viewing. The idea was novel in scale and conception. There had been smaller national exhibitions in France and elsewhere. There had not been anything on the scale that Albert proposed. Most of the political class thought the idea was impractical. Many thought it was actively bad, that it would attract revolutionaries and foreign undesirables, that it would damage British industry by exposing British inventions to foreign copying, that it would, in the words of one parliamentary opponent, lead to the moral and physical contamination of the British people by the influx of foreigners that the exhibition would attract. Albert pressed on through the opposition with the persistence that was his characteristic mode. He chaired a royal commission. He raised the funding through subscription and ticket sales rather than from the public purse. He oversaw the design of the exhibition building, the Great Crystal Palace, designed by Joseph Paxton, made of cast iron and glass, 600 meters long, the largest interior space ever constructed up to that point, and supervised its erection in Hyde Park over the autumn of 1850 and the winter of 1850 1851, he organised the contents over 100,000 exhibits from around the British Empire and from 44 foreign nations, displaying everything from the Koh-i-Noor diamond to the latest steam engines, to the carpets of Persia, to the agricultural implements of the American Midwest. The whole thing came together, against every reasonable expectation, on schedule and within budget. The Great Exhibition opened on the 1st of May 1851. Victoria and Albert opened it together. The opening ceremony, attended by a crowd of perhaps 30,000 inside the Crystal Palace and perhaps 500,000 outside it, was the high point of Albert's public career and one of the high points of the marriage. Victoria's journal entry for the day is one of the most unguardedly happy entries she ever wrote. She described it as the happiest, proudest day of her life. She described Albert in the repeated phrasing she used about him in moments of deepest feeling as her precious one, her dearest, dearest beloved, the source of all her happiness, the great, wise, good man whose work had produced the wonders that surrounded them. Let me describe the opening day a little more fully, because the sensory experience of it is part of what made it the moment that Victoria remembered for the rest of her life. The morning had been overcast in London, but by the time the royal procession reached the Crystal Palace at about 11 o'clock, that the sun had broken through the clouds and was streaming down through the vast glass roof of the building, as Joseph Paxton had designed the structure to permit. The interior of the Crystal Palace was, by every account of those who saw it that day, like nothing anyone had ever seen before. The space was on a scale that no enclosed space had previously achieved. 600 meters long, the great central transept rising to a vaulted ceiling that contained living elm trees that had been built around rather than cut down. The light came in from every direction. The 100,000 exhibits, the carriages, the steam engines, the agricultural implements, the textiles, the precious stones, the works of art, the displays of every nation's industry, were arranged in long avenues along the length of the building. The air was full of sound, the murmuring of the great crowd, the music of the choir and the organ that had been arranged for the opening, the announcements of the masters of ceremonies, the working hum of the machines that had been set in motion for the demonstration. Victoria entered through the south transept in the procession that had been carefully organised along the previous weeks. She was wearing a pink and silver gown with a coronet, in the dressing that the occasion required. Albert wore the uniform of a field marshal. Their two oldest children, Vicky, who was 10, and Bertie, who was 9, walked behind them in their child versions of formal court dress. The procession moved up the central avenue toward the dais that had been built for the opening ceremony beside the great central fountain. The crowd around them, exhibitors, dignitaries, foreign princes, the various distinguished guests who had been invited applauded as they passed. At the dais, the ceremony unfolded. Albert, as the president of the Royal Commission, read out the formal address to the Queen, describing the work of the Commission and the achievements of the exhibition. Victoria read out her formal reply, accepting the address and declaring the exhibition open. The choir sang the Hallelujah chorus from Handel's Messiah. The whole ceremony lasted perhaps 45 minutes. At the end, Victoria and Albert and the children walked the length of the building in the tour of the exhibits that the day required. The crowds parted for them. The applause continued throughout. Victoria was, by every account that survives, in a state of complete delight throughout the whole length of the morning. The journal entry she wrote that evening goes on for several thousand words. She described the building. She described the crowds. She described the music. She described the things she had noticed. The German exhibit, the French exhibit, the Indian textiles, the great working steam engine that had been demonstrated for her benefit. She described again and again in the entry Albert's role, his organization of the whole project, the patient work he had done through the previous 2 years to make this day possible, the public recognition he was finally receiving for the vision that the exhibition embodied. She wrote, in the repeated phrases that her happiness produced, that he was her own dear noble Albert, her precious one, the most perfect and wonderful of men. This is the day, more than any other in the marriage, that historians have generally identified as the high point, the marriage at its peak, the partnership at its full mature form. The two of them at 31 years old, with 7 of their 9 children already born, with the work of the previous decade reaching its public fruition, with the public acknowledgement of Albert's role finally arriving in the form that he had earned. Everything that the working partnership had been building toward over the previous 11 years had, on the 1st of May 1851, come together in how great public moments sometimes can. The exhibition ran for 6 months. It was visited by approximately 6 million people, at a time when the population of the United Kingdom was about 27 million. This meant that roughly 1 in 5 British people came to see it. It produced a profit of about 186,000, equivalent to perhaps £20 million in modern money, which Albert directed into a fund for the establishment of the South Kensington Museum and Educational Complex that would, around the rest of the 19th century, develop into the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Science Museum, the Natural History Museum, the Royal Albert Hall, and the various educational institutions of what is now South Kensington in London. The cluster of museums and institutions that occupies the south side of Hyde Park is, in some real sense, the architectural legacy of the 1851 exhibition and of Albert's vision for what an industrial nation could do with the wealth and creativity of its people. For Victoria, the Great Exhibition was the moment at which Albert's role in the marriage and the monarchy reached its full mature form. He was no longer the young husband finding his way into the work. He was no longer merely her partner in the daily administrative business. He was, by the spring of 1851, a major figure in his own right, the architect of the exhibition, the recognised public champion of British industry and arts and education, the visible presence at the centre of one of the great national moments of the century. Victoria's pride in him at the opening ceremony was, by every account, unfeigned. She had married in October of 1839 a serious young German prince. By May of 1851, she was married to a man who had, in the way of his methodical work along the previous decade, made himself into one of the most consequential figures in the British public life. Then, the years after the Great Exhibition were, in the arc of the marriage, the years of the deepening partnership and also gathering strain. Albert's workload throughout the 1850s was, by every reasonable measure, excessive. He had become, by this point, the de facto private secretary of the Queen, the figure through whom most of her official business now flowed, the figure who drafted most of her important correspondence, the figure who managed the constitutional position of the monarchy through the various political crises of the age. He also retained personal direction of the South Kensington Museum project, the educational reform initiatives he had taken on, the various royal estates that he was managing, the ongoing supervision of the children's education, and the long correspondence that connected him to the network of European royalties, including the daughters and sons-in-law who, as the older children began to marry in the late 1850s, were establishing themselves in the various European royal households that the marriages connected to. He worked, by his own accounts and by the accounts of those around him, perhaps 14 hours a day, year in and year out, with very little break. This was not sustainable. Albert was not, by physical constitution, a robust man. He had had recurring stomach trouble since his early 20s. He suffered from what we would now recognize as a chronic anxiety condition, expressed through digestive complaints, insomnia, and the low-grade exhaustion that accompanies overwork. His doctors warned him, more than once through the 1850s, that he was wearing himself out. He acknowledged the warnings. He did not change his pattern. He continued to work as he had been working in the methodical way that he had refined into his mode of being, because the work was, in his understanding of his life, what he was for. Victoria over the same period was managing the accumulating burdens of her own. The 1850s brought several pregnancies and births, with the additional difficulty of advancing age. Beatrice, the youngest child, was born in 1857 when Victoria was 38, an age at which 19th century childbirth carried significantly increased risks. The Crimean War from 1853 to 1856 had been a source of anxiety because Victoria had developed a deep personal concern for the British soldiers serving in the Crimea and had thrown herself into hospital visits, knitted comforts, and the gestures of royal attention to the wounded that the period considered appropriate. The death of Wellington in 1852 had taken from her one of the great presences of her early reign. The death of her own mother in March of 1861 would, when it came, take another. There was also in the private arc of the family the marriage of Vicky in January of 1858, which deserves its own moment of attention because of what it cost Victoria emotionally and what it revealed about the texture of her motherhood. Vicky, the eldest child, had been engaged in 1855 at the age of 14 to Prince Frederick of Prussia, the heir to the Prussian throne and the eventual founder, alongside her, of the German imperial line. The match had been arranged by Albert in the diplomatic logic that he had been refining around the late 1840s and 1850s, the logic that the future of Europe lay in a liberal united Germany under enlightened Prussian leadership, and that Vicky, as the future crown princess of Prussia, could be the agent of that liberalism within the German court. The engagement had been delayed for 3 years until Vicky was old enough to marry. The wedding took place at the Chapel Royal at St. James's on the 25th of January, 1858. She was about to leave England for Berlin in the 19th century way that royal daughters left their countries when they married, and she would not, except for occasional visits, return. The wedding itself was modelled because Victoria insisted on after her own wedding 18 years earlier. The same chapel, the same kind of white dress, the same Honiton lace. Victoria had wanted, in the private way that mothers want such things, to give Vicky the wedding she had had herself. The ceremony was duly performed. Frederick was a tall, serious young Prussian in his uniform, who had been Albert's choice for Vicky, and who had become, along the engagement period, a kind of younger brother to Albert in his way of thinking and his liberal politics. Vicky was pretty and clever, and had been her father's favourite child across her whole upbringing. She and Albert had been close. He had taken charge of her education from her early childhood, had taught her himself in many subjects, had shaped her intellectual and moral development with the attention he gave to all his projects. The bond between them was, in the accumulated way that the years had built it, one of the deep emotional facts of the family. The day of Vicky's wedding was for Albert harder than Victoria had been entirely prepared for. He gave Vicky away in the father of the bride way that the ceremony required. He sat through the wedding breakfast with composure. He saw Vicky and Frederick off at the railway station as they began the journey to Prussia. And then, in the private moment that Victoria's journal recorded, Albert returned to Buckingham Palace and broke down completely. He wept for hours. He said in the fragments that the journal preserves that he had never imagined how much he would miss her, that she had been his great companion in his work, that the house would not be the same without her. Victoria was, by her own account in the journal, somewhat surprised by the depth of Albert's feeling. She had loved Vicky too, of course, but Albert's grief at Vicky's leaving was at a different level from Victoria's. It was in some private way the first warning sign that the working partnership which had been the ground of Albert's adult life was beginning to lose pieces of itself, and that the loss was hitting him harder than the surface composure had suggested. He recovered, of course. The work continued. But the journal entries from January and February of 1858 show a man who was in some private way more vulnerable to loss than the working partner of the previous 15 years had appeared to be. The correspondence between Albert and Vicky throughout the next 3 years, until his death, became one of the private channels of the family. They wrote to each other every week. He continued, in the long letters he sent her, the intellectual and political education that had been the central work of her childhood. She wrote back from her difficult position in the Berlin court, with descriptions of Prussian life and her growing involvement in it. The first grandchild, the future Kaiser Wilhelm II, was born in January of 1859 with a difficult breech delivery that left him with a permanently disabled left arm, and probably caused some of the cognitive and personality difficulties that would shape his catastrophic reign half a century later. Albert and Victoria became grandparents by the fact that intelligent middle-aged parents become grandparents. The European dynastic web that the 19th century had been weaving in the various royal houses was, with Vicky's marriage and her first child, beginning to take its full shape around them. The political life of the 1850s was also more difficult than the political life of the early years had been. Lord Melbourne had retired in 1841 and died in 1848, removing from Victoria's life the paternal mentor of her early reign. The prime ministers who followed, Peel, Russell, Derby, Aberdeen, Palmerston, were various and often difficult. Lord Palmerston in particular, who served as Foreign Secretary across much of the 1850s and as Prime Minister from 1855, was a figure whom Victoria and Albert both deeply distrusted. They considered him reckless in foreign policy, insufficiently respectful of royal prerogative, and personally morally questionable in ways that the Coburg morals of Albert found offensive. The relationship between the Crown and Palmerston's government was, across much of the late 1850s, one of the working irritations of Albert's life. The marriage itself across these years was, by all surviving evidence, deepening rather than weakening. The tensions of the early years, Albert's struggle for a meaningful role, Victoria's reluctance to share her sovereignty, had been gradually worked through. The two of them had become, by the late 1850s, a working partnership in which each one's strengths complemented the other's, and in which the daily adjustments that any long marriage requires had been refined to a high level of mutual understanding. They were no longer, through how the surviving correspondence reveals, quite the passionate young lovers they had been at the start. They were something else, something deeper and more. A married couple of nearly 2 decades, with 9 children and 3 estates, and a working monarchy between them, who had become so practiced at the daily collaboration of their lives that the partnership itself was now the love. There were also, in the honest accounting that this story requires, occasional difficulties. Victoria's temper, never an easy thing, became more difficult after several of the births. She would, in her postnatal periods, become irritable, demanding, prone to outbursts that Albert had to carefully manage. He developed through the years a technique for dealing with her in these states. He would go, in the way of a man who knew her well, into another room and write her a long letter, explaining what he thought she had done that was unreasonable and asking her to consider his perspective. The letters were delivered, often via the household staff, while Albert and Victoria were both in the same house. She would read them. She would sometimes apologize. She would sometimes not. The cycle would continue. The written communication of two people who were too close to each other for direct verbal disagreement was one of the working mechanisms of the marriage across its later years. The marriage in 1860 and the early months of 1861 was, in the arc of the surviving evidence, in a state of mature satisfaction. Victoria was 41. Albert was 41. Their oldest daughter Vicky had been married to Prince Frederick of Prussia in 1858 and had given birth to their first grandchild, the future Kaiser Wilhelm II, in early 1859. The other older children were beginning to take their adult places in the world. The political work continued, the estates continued. The daily life of the marriage continued in its established forms. Then, in the unforeseen way that a healthy life can be undone, the year 1861 began to gather around them. The first blow came in March of 1861. Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, died on the 16th of March, after a steadily worsening illness over the previous months. The relationship between Victoria and her mother had been complicated for the whole of Victoria's adult life. The Kensington System and the bitterness of Victoria's first months as Queen had produced a long estrangement, and the gradual reconciliation around the 1840s and 1850s had been incomplete. The death itself, when it came, was followed by Victoria's discovery, going through her mother's papers, that the Duchess had kept all of Victoria's childhood letters, all the tokens of Victoria's growing up years, all the documentation of a love that the Duchess had carried for Victoria along the long, bitter estrangement. The discovery devastated Victoria. She fell into a state of mourning that lasted for months. Albert was, across these months, the one who managed her, handling her correspondence, sitting with her in her grief, gently encouraging her back into the working life that her duties required. The drain on Albert across this period was substantial. The second difficulty came in November of 1861. Their oldest son, Bertie, the Prince of Wales, then 20 years old, had been involved in a brief, unwise sexual relationship with an Irish actress named Nellie Clifton during military training in Ireland over the summer. The relationship had ended. The fact of it, however, had reached Albert's ears in November via a series of indignant letters from various sources who considered it their duty to inform the Prince Consort of his son's misconduct. Albert was, by every account, devastated. The project of producing dignified moral children, the project that had occupied him for 20 years, the project that was supposed to be the answer to his own broken childhood, appeared to have failed in its most important case. The heir to the throne was, in his father's view, a moral failure. The succession was at risk. Albert was by this point ill. He had been ill, in a low-grade way, for several weeks. Stomach trouble, weakness, a tiredness that was worse than his usual overworked tiredness. But he travelled to Cambridge on the 25th of November, in cold, wet weather, to confront Bertie about Nellie Clifton. The interview was, by every account, painful. Albert returned to Windsor on the 26th in worse health than he had left in, and the cold he had taken on the journey settled, throughout the next 2 weeks, into something considerably more serious than a cold. The illness that killed Albert in the first 2 weeks of December 1861 has been the subject of considerable medical historical debate. The official diagnosis at the time was typhoid fever. Modern historians looking at the symptoms and the trajectory have suggested various other possibilities: Crohn's disease, abdominal cancer, a generalized collapse from many years of overwork rather than a single acute illness. The truth is that we do not know precisely what killed him. What we know is that through the first 2 weeks of December 1861, Albert deteriorated rapidly, that the doctors who attended him were unable to identify the illness clearly enough to treat it effectively, and that by the second week of December it was apparent to those around him that he was not going to recover. Victoria, for the first part of the illness, was kept partly in the dark by Albert's doctors. They did not want, where 19th century medicine often handled such things, to alarm the Queen unnecessarily. They reassured her when she inquired that Albert's illness was serious but not desperate. She accepted these reassurances with the trust that her training had given her. She continued, over the early days of December, to work through her correspondence in the next room while Albert lay ill in the Blue Room at Windsor. The Blue Room at Windsor Castle, where Albert was being nursed, was a bedroom on the first floor of the castle, decorated in blue silk and used as a guest room and occasionally as a sick room. Albert had been moved there on the 7th of December because the larger bedroom he and Victoria normally shared was thought too cold for an invalid in midwinter. Around the next week, the Blue Room became the centre of the household's anxious attention, with the doctors coming in and out, the elder children arriving from their various locations, the Queen sitting beside the bed for increasing portions of each day, as it became clear that Albert's condition was worsening rather than improving. By the morning of the 14th of December 1861, a Saturday, it was clear to everyone in the room that the end was close. Albert was conscious. He was breathing with difficulty. He was, in the fragmentary words he was still able to produce, saying farewells to those around him. Victoria sat beside the bed for most of the day, holding his hand, leaning over to catch the things he was saying. The older children, Bertie among them, recalled from Cambridge, gathered in the room. The doctors stood in the corner. The fire was made up. The afternoon wore on into the evening. Let me walk you slowly through the last day of Albert's life, because the contemporary accounts preserve it in considerable detail, and because the scene at the bedside is the still centre of the whole story. The morning of the 14th of December 1861 was cold and damp at Windsor. Albert had been in the Blue Room since the 7th. Along the previous week, he had had brief periods of apparent improvement that had given Victoria and the doctors hope, followed by sharper declines that had taken the hope away. The pattern by the morning of the 14th was clearly downward. He had been growing weaker since the previous evening. He had not slept well. He was breathing with difficulty. His mind, which had been clear across most of the illness, was beginning to wander as the dying mind wanders. Victoria was called to the room early. She came in her dressing gown. She sat beside the bed and held his hand. He looked at her and said, in German, the word for good night that he had said to her every night of the marriage. She kissed him. She told him she loved him. Throughout the morning the children began to arrive. Bertie had come down from Cambridge several days earlier and was already in the castle. Alice, who had been nursing Albert in the previous week with devotion that had impressed everyone in the household, was at the bedside. Helena and Louise, the next daughters, were in the room. Arthur and Leopold and Beatrice, the younger children, were brought in for brief visits at intervals through the day. Vicky was in Berlin and could not be reached in time. The 7 children who were in England gathered, in the succession that the dying room of a long marriage requires, around the bed of their dying father. The doctors continued to attend. They had, by this point, given up on most of the active treatments they had tried over the previous week. There was nothing more they could do. They could only keep him as comfortable as possible and wait. They moved in and out of the room, taking his pulse, listening to his breathing, exchanging the glances that doctors of dying patients exchange. The afternoon passed slowly. The light at Windsor in mid-December failed early. By 4 o'clock the lamps had been lit in the blue room. Victoria continued to sit beside the bed. She held his hand. She leaned over to him at intervals to catch the things he was saying, which were now mostly fragments, German phrases, words to people, the last expressions of a mind that was loosening from the world. He recognized her at intervals. He recognized the children. He was, in the way of a dying man whose family has gathered, conscious of the love around him in his last hours. At about 10:30 in the evening, his breathing began to change in how the doctors had been watching for. They closed in around the bed. Victoria leaned over him. The children gathered. The fire in the grate was made up. The room was by this point full of people in absolute silence. Watching for the moment, Albert breathed slowly around the next 20 minutes. He breathed, then paused, then breathed again. Victoria held his hand throughout. At 10 minutes before 11 o'clock, he breathed once more, paused, and did not breathe again. The doctors waited the interval. They confirmed the death. The Prince Consort was dead. Victoria, by the accounts of those present, did not in the immediate moment react in any obvious way. She kissed him. She kissed him again. She held his hand and continued to hold it. She did not weep openly. She did not speak. The children began to weep. Alice, who had been holding Albert's other hand, broke down. Bertie wept. The younger children wept. The doctors withdrew respectfully to the corner. Victoria sat beside the bed in the silence of a woman who had not yet, in any internal way, registered what had just happened. She continued to sit there for some time. Eventually her ladies came in and gently led her away to her own apartments. She was, by the accounts of those who walked her down the corridor, in a state of trance, not weeping, not speaking, not in any external way expressing what had happened. The grief would come. It would come in waves along the next days and weeks and months and years. It had not yet come in the first hour after his death in any form that her ladies could see. Albert died at 10 minutes before 11 o'clock on the evening of the 14th of December, 1861, with Victoria holding his hand. He was 42 years old. The marriage had lasted 21 years and 10 months. Their youngest child, Beatrice, was 4 years old. Their oldest, Vicky, was 21 and pregnant with her second child. Victoria herself was 42 years old, the same age as Albert, and was about to begin a widowhood that would last for the next 39 years. Let me pause here, because what happens next is the part of this story that I find most genuinely remarkable and that I want to walk through slowly. When Albert died on the night of the 14th of December, 1861, Victoria did not, in any immediate way, accept that he was dead. The accounts of the days that followed make this clear. She kissed him good-night in the way she had always kissed him good-night, even after he had stopped breathing. She left the room, came back, and kissed him again. She refused for several hours to leave the blue room. Her doctors and her ladies eventually managed to lead her away to her own bedroom in the hours of the 15th, but she was, for the first several days after his death, in a state that the modern reader will recognize as acute traumatic shock. What she did throughout the next several months, and in the next several decades, was something more than mourn him. She built, in the methodical way that had always been one of her characteristic modes when she was applying herself to a project, a system of preservation. The system was designed in the private logic that grief had given her to keep Albert as present in her daily life as the physical fact of his absence permitted. Let me describe this system, because it is one of the most remarkable acts of sustained marital devotion in the historical record. The Blue Room at Windsor Castle, where Albert had died, was preserved exactly as it had been at the moment of his death. The bed where he had lain was kept made up. The water glass at the bedside was kept filled. The medicine bottles on the bedside table were left where they had been. The fire was kept laid in the grate, ready to be lit, as it had been lit on the evening of his death. Through the next 40 years, until Victoria's own death in 1901, the Blue Room at Windsor was maintained in the precise state it had been in at 10 minutes before 11, on the night of the 14th of December 1861. Servants came in each morning to dust. Fresh water was brought. Fresh flowers were placed. The room was, in some private sense, never allowed to acknowledge that the man who had died in it was no longer there. Albert's other rooms over the various royal residences were preserved in similar ways. His dressing room at Windsor was maintained exactly. His clothes were brushed and laid out. His shaving water was brought up each morning, hot, ready for use. His towels were changed daily. His writing desk was kept in working order, with fresh paper, sharpened pens, ink in the inkwell. The instruction that Victoria had given to her household, in the way she gave such instructions, was that Albert's rooms should be maintained as if he might walk back into them at any moment. The household followed the instruction for the rest of her life. She herself wore mourning for Albert for the rest of her life. She had been, before his death, a woman who liked colour-bright dresses, jewels, the pleasures of fashion that her position permitted. After his death she wore black. Not the conventional Victorian mourning black of 1 or 2 years that the etiquette from the period prescribed for widows, but the full and continuing black of the woman who had decided that she would never again be other than in mourning for the husband she had lost. The black dresses, the black bonnets, the black gloves, the black jewellery jet rather than diamond, because mourning jewellery worked became her permanent uniform around the next 40 years. Her image in the public mind along the second half of her reign, the black-clad widow of Windsor, the imperious mourning matriarch, was the result of this decision taken in the first weeks after Albert's death and maintained without variation for 40 years. The mourning extended to the entire royal household throughout the years immediately after Albert's death. The household staff wore black armbands. The horses pulling the royal carriages were dressed in black harness. The carriages themselves were painted in dark mourning colours. Even the royal stationery for the first decade of the widowhood was edged in black in the Victorian way that bereavement was indicated. The whole texture of the daily court life was, in the years after 1861, organised around the continuing fact that the Queen was in mourning and that the household was in mourning with her. The instruction Victoria gave to her household about Albert's rooms was specific. The clothes were to be brushed each day and laid out fresh on the bed and the chair. The shaving water was to be brought up at his usual hour, hot, in the silver jug. The towels were to be changed. The clean linen was to be put out. The desk was to be dusted. The papers and pens were to be arranged as they had been on the morning of his last working day. The fresh flowers were to be brought in each day and placed in the arrangements he had liked. None of this was done with the expectation that he would return. It was done in the logic of the ritual, because doing it was the way Victoria kept the marriage alive in the daily texture of the household. The rooms were not preserved as a museum. They were maintained as a working arrangement in the continuing way that they had been maintained when he was using them. The Frogmore Mausoleum deserves its own description, because it is one of the more remarkable funerary monuments of the 19th century, and because the building of it occupied much of the first decade of Victoria's widowhood. The site was chosen within weeks of Albert's death. The grounds at Frogmore, in the home park at Windsor, were selected for their privacy and for their proximity to the family's working residence at the castle. The architect was Albert Jenkins Humbert, a young architect who had worked with Albert on various royal projects, and whom Victoria trusted to carry out Albert's aesthetic preferences. The interior decoration was designed by Ludwig Gruner, the German-born art advisor who had been Albert's principal collaborator on the various decorative projects in the working years of the marriage. The whole project was, in some way, a posthumous collaboration with Albert, designed by people he had worked with in the styles he had favoured, with the attention to detail that he himself would have given the project if he had lived to oversee it. Construction began in 1862 and continued in stages for almost a decade. The exterior was completed by 1864. The interior decoration, the marble linings, the frescoes, the mosaic floors was completed in stages through the rest of the 1860s. The double tomb at the centre was installed in 1867. The full completion was reached in 1871, 10 years after Albert's death. The mausoleum is cruciform in plan, with a central domed space rising about 70 feet above the floor. The exterior is granite. The interior is lined with marble in various colours. The frescoes on the walls and the dome depict religious subjects in the Italianate style that Albert had favoured. The floor is laid in patterned mosaic. The light enters through windows high in the walls, falling at angles over the central space. The whole effect is intentionally solemn rather than grand, intimate rather than imposing, a private chapel for two people rather than a public monument to a king. At the centre of the building is the double tomb. It is made of grey Aberdeen granite, with marble effigies on the top. The effigy of Albert was carved in 1862 by the sculptor Carlo Marochetti, an Italian-born sculptor who had worked for the royal family around the previous decade. The effigy of Victoria was carved at the same time, in 1862 also by Marochetti, in advance of her own eventual death. Both effigies depict the two of them as they had been at the age of 42. The age Albert was at his death, the age Victoria was when he died. The effigies lie side by side on top of the tomb, with their hands at their sides, with their faces composed in the funerary calm that the Victorian effigy required. The effigies have been there together since 1867, even though Victoria's body would not actually join Albert's body in the tomb beneath the effigies for another 34 years. This is one of the features of the Victoria widowhood that I find genuinely affecting. She had her own funeral effigy made when she was 42, in the year after Albert's death, and had it placed beside his on the tomb that was waiting for both of them. For the next 34 years, every time she visited the mausoleum, she was visiting her own future tomb. She was lying down, in the marble representation, beside her dead husband, in advance of the day when she would actually lie down beside him, in fact. The waiting effigy was, in some real sense, the central physical symbol of the widowhood. She was already, in advance, where she was going to be. Her visits to the mausoleum along the 40 years of the widowhood were one of the features of her year. She went on the anniversaries, Albert's birthday in August, his death day in December, their wedding anniversary in February, but also at intervals throughout the year, whenever she was at Windsor and felt drawn to go. She would have a carriage, take her down from the castle. She would walk into the central space alone, in the private way that she preferred. She would stand for a while beside the tomb. She would sometimes pray. She would sometimes weep. She would sometimes simply stand in silence and look at the effigies. She would, after some interval, leave and return to the castle. The visits were the physical expression of the continuing communion with Albert that her widowhood had built into the structure of her year. The Frogmore Mausoleum is still there. You can visit it on the occasions when it is open to the public and stand where Victoria stood, looking at the effigies of the two of them lying side by side as they were carved in 1862. The effigies are small. The figures are perhaps a little smaller than life-size by the fact that funeral effigies sometimes are. They look young. They look, because the effigies preserve, as the two of them looked at the moment when the marriage ended, at 42 years old, in the prime of their working partnership, on the verge of the third decade of their marriage that they were never going to have. She had, on the morning after Albert's death, ordered that a plaster cast be made of his right hand, and the cast, when it was made, was placed beside her bed and was kept there for the rest of her life. She slept, in the 40 years of her widowhood, with Albert's plaster hand on the bedside table beside her. She kissed it each night before she went to sleep. She kissed it each morning when she awoke. She had it with her at Windsor, at Buckingham Palace, at Osborne, at Balmoral, in the various locations where her widowhood was conducted, in the permanent ritual that had begun on the morning of the 15th of December, 1861. Above her bed, in each of her residences, there was an engraved portrait of Albert as he had appeared in death, eyes closed, face composed, the study that one of the court artists had made of him in the hours after his death. The engraving was the last thing she looked at before sleeping. It was the first thing she looked at on waking. The continuous presence of Albert in her bedroom, across her waking and sleeping hours, was one of the features of her widowhood for 40 years. She had at Frogmore in the gardens of Windsor the great mausoleum built that would eventually receive both their bodies. The planning began within weeks of Albert's death. The construction began in 1862. The building was substantially complete by 1871. The mausoleum is a cruciform structure in granite and marble, in the Italian Renaissance style that Albert had favoured during his lifetime. The interior is lined with marble and decorated with frescoes by artists who had worked with Albert on his various decorative projects. At the centre of the building is a great double tomb, designed in marble, with effigies of Victoria and Albert lying side by side. The effigy of Albert was made in 1862, in the year after his death. The effigy of Victoria was made at the same time, in advance, against the day when she would join him there. She visited the mausoleum regularly through the next 40 years, sometimes weekly, often with her children, in the pilgrimage that had become one of the structuring rituals of her year. These are the external systems, the dresses, the rooms, the rituals, the mausoleum. They are by themselves remarkable. But what I want you to understand is that they were the visible expression of an internal continuity that was even more remarkable, and that is the part of the story that I find most genuinely striking about Victoria's widowhood. Victoria, in her own private understanding, did not consider Albert dead in the ordinary sense. She considered him absent. She considered him gone ahead of her, into the next world where he was waiting for her to join him. She considered the marriage continuing in the private way that her religious convictions and her continuing love permitted. She wrote to him in her journal over the 40 years of her widowhood, not in any spiritualist sense, not in any belief that he was reading the entries, but through how a wife who had been used to talking to her husband every day continued to talk to him after he was gone. Her decisions about her children, political positions, Her decisions about the matters of household management, these were considered, in the private way that her journal recorded, against the question of what Albert would have wanted. He remained, in some real sense, the moral and intellectual centre of her life around the entire 40 years he had been dead. This is the thing that makes the Victoria and Albert story different from most other great love stories of the historical record. It did not end with his death. It continued in a kind of one-sided continuation that Victoria sustained through sheer force of devotion along the 4 decades she had to live without him. The marriage that had begun on the 10th of February 1840 did not end on the 14th of December 1861. It continued, in Victoria's private understanding of it, until her own death in 1901. The widowhood was not, in the honest accounting, an entirely admirable thing in all its expressions. Victoria's decision to withdraw from public life throughout the early years of her widowhood, she essentially refused to perform most of her ceremonial royal duties for nearly a decade after Albert's death, produced a serious constitutional crisis by the late 1860s. Republican sentiment grew. The phrase "the widow of Windsor" became a popular target of political satire. There was real discussion by the early 1870s of whether the monarchy was still a viable institution if its sovereign was unwilling to perform the public functions that the position required. Victoria was eventually persuaded back into a fuller engagement with public life, partly by her ministers and partly by her own gradual emergence from the worst of the grief. But the period from 1861 to roughly 1872 was for the British monarchy as an institution a difficult and damaging time. Her relationship with her older children in the widowhood was also, by every account, difficult. She was demanding. She was prone to long letters of criticism and complaint. She was hard on Bertie, whose involvement in the Nellie Clifton affair she blamed in some private corner of her mind. For Albert's death, she had decided, in the unfair private logic that grief sometimes produces, that the strain of dealing with Bertie's misconduct in November of 1861 had weakened Albert's resistance to the illness that killed him in December. The judgment was unjust. Albert's health had been failing for months before the Nellie Clifton affair. The strain of the Cambridge confrontation could not, by any reasonable medical accounting, have caused his death by typhoid 2 weeks later. But Victoria carried the judgment against Bertie for the rest of her life. The relationship between mother and heir was, through the 40 years of the widowhood, one of the difficulties of her life and his. Then there is the question of John Brown, which I want to address honestly because it is the part of the widowhood story that has produced the most speculation and the most uncertainty over the decades since Victoria's death. The answer requires a walkthrough of who he was, what he meant to her, and what the surviving evidence does and does not tell us about the relationship. John Brown was a Highland servant who had been employed on the estate at Balmoral since the 1840s, and who had been one of the local figures during Victoria and Albert's annual autumn visits to Scotland. He was, by every account, a tall and handsome man, plain-spoken in the Scottish manner, devoted to the royal family in the way of a long-serving estate retainer, and notably free of the deferential courtly manner that characterised most of the household staff. He addressed Victoria as woman, rather than as Your Majesty. He spoke his mind. He was, by the fact that his role permitted, comfortable with the Queen in a way that very few of her servants were. Albert had liked Brown, where one trusts a reliable estate worker. Brown had been one of the men who attended on the family during the long autumn stays at Balmoral around the 1850s. He had led Victoria's pony on the long Highland walks that had been one of the great pleasures of those autumn weeks. He had been part of the local fabric that made Balmoral what it was for the family, the Scottish staff, the Highland customs, the daily contact with people whose lives were entirely outside the formal court life of the South. Albert's own affection for Scotland and for the Highland life had been, along the years, one of the features of the marriage, and Brown had been part of the texture of that affection. The decision in 1864 to bring Brown south as Victoria's personal attendant was, in some private way, an extension of Albert's own preferences into the widowhood, bringing the Highland steadiness that Albert had loved into the daily routines of the widow he had left behind. In the depths of Victoria's grief in 1864 and 1865, when she had still not emerged from the worst of the seclusion at Osborne and Windsor, her Highland staff suggested that Brown be brought south from Balmoral as her personal attendant, on the theory that the Highland air and the Highland manners might do for the Queen's spirits what the conventional court life was failing to do. He took up the position of the Queen's personal attendant in 1865. He held it until his death in 1883. Across those 18 years, he was a constant daily presence in Victoria's life, leading her pony when she rode, attending her on her drives, sitting outside her room when she worked, accompanying her on the various journeys and migrations of the royal year. The relationship between Victoria and John Brown across these 18 years has been the subject of enormous speculation, both in their own time and since. The contemporary court found the closeness of the relationship unusual and, in some quarters, scandalous. Brown was a servant. Victoria was the Queen. The intimacy of their daily interaction, the way she relied on him, the way he spoke to her, the way she grew visibly more cheerful in his presence, was, by the standards belonging to that world, considered a transgression of the proper relations between sovereign and servant. There were whispers throughout the late 1860s and the 1870s of various kinds. The phrase Mrs. Brown entered circulation as a satirical nickname for the Queen. There were suggestions, never substantiated, that the relationship was sexual. There were even suggestions, never remotely substantiated, that there had been a secret marriage. What is the honest answer to this question? The honest answer is that we do not, with certainty, know. The papers that might have settled the question one way or the other were extensively edited and in some cases destroyed by Victoria's daughter Beatrice in the years after Victoria's death, in the Victorian project of curating the public memory of the Queen's life. What survives from the period is consistent with several different interpretations. The most cautious historians have generally concluded that the relationship was a profound emotional friendship that gave Victoria something she desperately needed in her grief, a companion who treated her as a person rather than as an institution, who was warmly with her at a time when she was struggling, who stood in some adjacent relation to the Albert-shaped hole in her life without claiming to fill it. Whether the friendship had any physical dimension is something the surviving evidence does not establish. What I want to say about John Brown, as this love story requires, is this. Whatever the precise nature of the relationship, it did not displace Albert in Victoria's interior life. The mourning rituals continued without interruption across all the years of John Brown's service. The plaster hand remained beside her bed. The blue room at Windsor remained preserved. The journal entries continued to be addressed in their private way to Albert. Brown was by every account important to her. He was not, in any sense that the surviving evidence supports, a replacement for the husband she had lost. The Albert and Victoria love story did not end because John Brown entered it. The story expanded, in the complicated way that long widowhoods sometimes do, to include another person whose presence eased Victoria's grief without, in any decisive way, ending it. Brown died in March of 1883 after a brief illness at the age of 56. Victoria mourned him deeply. She had a statue erected to him at Balmoral. She wrote a tribute volume that her ministers eventually persuaded her not to publish, on the grounds that the level of grief expressed for a servant would be considered unseemly by the public. She was, in the decade after his death, never quite the same person she had been with him in the household, but she did not, in any sense, redirect her grief from Albert to Brown. Brown was, in the private accounting of her interior life, a separate matter, a beloved servant whose loss was real, but whose place was not the place that Albert had occupied. The private architecture that the burial instructions later revealed is in this sense the honest answer to the question. Albert in the visible places, Brown concealed in the left hand under the posy. Both real, not the same. The years after Brown's death, the 1880s and 1890s, were the years of Victoria's gradual emergence from the deepest part of her widowhood into the strange late flourishing that her final 2 decades produced. She had become, by the late 1880s, the imperial Queen Empress of a vast and continuously expanding empire. Empress of India had been added to her titles in 1876, and the British Empire through the late 19th century had grown into the largest empire in human history. She had, in some way that her widowhood had not entirely diminished, become the most recognizable figure of the age. Her Golden Jubilee in 1887 and her Diamond Jubilee in 1897 were both moments of vast public celebration in which the 70-something widow of Windsor stood at the centre of imperial pageants of unprecedented scale. Across these later years, the widowhood rituals continued without alteration. The mourning dresses, the blue room, the plaster hand, the Frogmore Mausoleum visits, the journal entries to Albert, the letters from her older children, Vicky in Berlin and Alice's surviving children in Hesse, were considered always with reference to what Albert would have thought, advised, decided. He remained, over the 4 decades of her widowhood, the moral compass that the marriage had made him into around the 21 years they had together. There were also, by the 1890s, the inevitable accumulating losses that age and time had brought. Alice, Victoria's 3rd child, had died in 1878 of diphtheria, a loss that had nearly destroyed Victoria for the 2nd time. Leopold, the haemophiliac son, had died in 1884 of internal bleeding after a fall. Vicky, the eldest, had her own tragedies in Germany, the death of her husband Frederick, after only 99 days as emperor in 1888, the increasingly difficult relationship with her son Wilhelm, who was now Kaiser. The grandchildren were growing up. Alice's daughter Alix had become Empress of Russia in 1894, married to Nicholas II. The European royal families were intermarrying along the generations in the dynastic way that the 19th century had refined to its own pattern. Through all of it, Victoria continued. She was, by the late 1890s, in her late 70s, increasingly stout, increasingly slow, increasingly afflicted with the various ailments that long lives produce. Her sight was failing. By the end she could barely read her own correspondence and had to have most of it read aloud to her by her daughters and her ladies. Her appetite was declining, her energy was declining. She continued to keep her journal each evening, in the way she had kept it since she was 13, in a hand that was steadily growing more cramped and more difficult. The Diamond Jubilee in June of 1897, celebrating 60 years on the throne, was the last great public moment of her reign. She rode, in an open carriage, through 6 miles of London streets lined with cheering crowds in the procession that had been organised to mark the longest reign in British history up to that point. She was 78. The procession was exhausting for her. The cheers were enormous. She wrote in her journal that evening, in her failing hand, that the day had been deeply moving and that she was deeply grateful for the affection of her people. Journal entry is a reminder that Victoria, even at 78 and 3 decades into her widowhood, was still working, still keeping the journal, still receiving her ministers, still doing the daily labour of being the Queen. Throughout the autumn of 1900, her health began to fail in a more serious way. She had been steadily slowing in the previous year, but the autumn of 1900 brought a clearer decline, loss of appetite, loss of energy, periods of confusion. She moved to Osborne House, on the Isle of Wight, for the Christmas of 1900, in the annual migration that had been her habit for over 50 years. She spent Christmas with the assembled family, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. The journal entries from December of 1900 grow shorter and more difficult to read, but they continue. She continued to work in the way she had always worked until the last week of her life. The final illness began in the 3rd week of January 1901. She was 81 years old. The doctors who attended her could not identify any single cause. She was simply, in the medical phrase from that era, failing. The family was summoned. The various royal grandchildren and great-grandchildren made their way to Osborne. Her son Bertie, the heir, who was now 60 years old, sat beside her bed in the way his father had once sat beside the beds of the dying. Her grandson Wilhelm, the Kaiser, travelled from Berlin and arrived in time to be present. The various other children and grandchildren gathered. Victoria died on the evening of the 22nd of January 1901 at 6:30 in the evening. She was 81 years old. She had been queen for 63 years and 7 months. She had been a widow for 39 years and 39 days. The death itself is recorded in considerable detail by those who were present. Through the final hours of the 22nd of January, the family gathered around the bed in the bedroom at Osborne House. Bertie was on one side. The Kaiser was nearby. The various daughters, Helena, Louise, Beatrice, were in the room. Doctors moved in and out. The afternoon passed slowly toward evening. Victoria was conscious but quiet. She murmured occasionally. She did not speak at length. The various grandchildren were brought in to say goodbye in how the Victorian deathbed permitted. The light faded. The fire was made up. At about 6:15 on the evening of the 22nd of January, Victoria's breathing changed, because experienced sick-room attendants recognized the approach of death. The family closed in around the bed. The Kaiser, by some accounts, was holding her on one side. Her son Bertie was on the other. She breathed slowly over the next 15 minutes. At 6:30, in the moment that the long life produced as its conclusion, she stopped breathing. The doctors confirmed the death. The Queen was dead. Now I want to tell you about the instructions she had left for her own funeral, because they are among the most touching documents in the historical record of 19th century royal devotion, and because they are the natural conclusion to the love story we have been following across this evening. Victoria had, around the years of her widowhood, prepared a set of written instructions for what should be done with her body when she died. The instructions had been drafted, revised, finalized, and locked away in the Victorian way of a woman who wanted everything to be done correctly when the time came. The instructions were opened by her ladies in the days after her death, by the fact that the household required, and were carried out with fidelity to her wishes. The first instruction was that she be buried in white rather than black. The widow who had worn mourning black for 40 years did not wish to be buried in it. She had, in the private logic of the woman who had been waiting to rejoin her husband along the 4 decades, decided that the moment of joining him should be marked in white, the colour of the bride going to her wedding, in the echo of the day in February of 1840 when she had walked down the aisle of the Chapel Royal in her white satin dress to marry him. The white funeral dress had been prepared in advance. She was dressed in it after her death, in the work that her ladies performed in the bedroom at Osborne in the hours after her passing. The second instruction concerned what was to be placed in the coffin with her. The list, written out in her own hand, was long and specific. It included Albert's dressing gown, taken from his preserved rooms at Windsor, folded and laid beside her in the coffin. It included a plaster cast of his hand, the cast that had lain beside her bed for 40 years, now coming with her into the grave. It included locks of his hair, gathered and preserved in packets. It included photographs of him at various ages, including the engraving of him in death that had hung above her bed throughout the widowhood. It included various mementos of the marriage pieces of jewellery he had given her, handkerchiefs they had shared, objects whose meaning had been only theirs. The full list of items placed in the coffin with her ran to several pages of her instructions. They were all, without exception, items associated with Albert. The coffin into which she was being lowered was, by her design, a coffin in which her marriage to Albert was being brought back together at the level of the physical objects that had been the daily currency of their 21 years. There was also one item that was not associated with Albert. Among the instructions was a note specifying that John Brown's photograph and a lock of John Brown's hair were to be placed in her left hand, hidden underneath a posy of flowers so that no one would see it. The arrangement was carried out by her dresser, the woman who had attended Victoria in the last years and who knew the private instructions. The brown photograph and the lock of his hair went into her left hand, concealed by the flowers, in the private gesture that Victoria had wanted to make for the man whose companionship had eased her widowhood. The principal items, the dressing gown, the hand, the locks of Albert's hair, were arranged around her body in the more visible positions. The brown items were tucked away in the private compartment that the posy of flowers concealed. This is, in some real sense, the honest answer to the John Brown question that the gossip and the speculation have been asking for over 100 years. Victoria's private instructions for her burial included Brown alongside Albert, in a way that acknowledged the significance of both relationships without confusing them. Albert was the husband, whose objects went into the coffin in the visible places. Brown was the beloved companion, whose photograph went into the concealed place that she could carry into the grave with her without making it a public statement. The private architecture of her burial reflected, with considerable honesty, her life through the 40 years of her widowhood. Both relationships had been real, they had not been the same. The burial honoured both, in the private way that Victoria had decided was appropriate. The funeral itself took place on the 2nd of February 1901, in the sequence that her instructions had prescribed. Her body was taken from Osborne by the Royal Yacht Alberta to Portsmouth, with the family in attendance and the warships of the Royal Navy lining the route. From Portsmouth she was taken by train to London, and then to Windsor, where the funeral service was held at St. George's Chapel. After the service, her coffin was placed in the Albert Memorial Chapel temporarily, through how the funeral arrangements required. The final burial took place 2 days later, on the 4th of February, at the Frogmore Mausoleum that she had built for the two of them over the decade after Albert's death. Let me sit with the burial for a moment, because the procession from Osborne to Frogmore around the first 4 days of February 1901 deserves to be walked through. The body of Victoria, dressed in white, with Albert's dressing gown folded beside her in the coffin and the plaster hand, and the locks of his hair and the photographs, and the various other Albert-associated items arranged around her in the private way her instructions had specified, and with John Brown's photograph and lock of hair concealed in her left hand under the posy, was placed in a coffin at Osborne House on the morning of the 1st of February. The coffin was carried down to the landing at East Cowes, where the royal yacht Alberta, named after Albert, was waiting. The yacht crossed the Solent to Portsmouth on the afternoon of the 1st, with the ships of the Royal Navy lining the route in the naval ceremony that the death of the Queen Empress required. From Portsmouth, a special train carried the coffin to London, arriving at Victoria Station named after her, in the coincidence of 19th century imperial nomenclature, on the afternoon of the 2nd. The funeral service was held at St. George's Chapel at Windsor on the morning of the 2nd of February. The chapel was full. Her son Bertie, now King Edward VII, was at the front. The grandchildren and the foreign royal cousins were ranged behind him. The Kaiser, the various German princes, the various smaller royal figures who had gathered for the funeral of the matriarch of European royalty. The service followed the standard form of the Anglican burial service. The choir sang, the archbishop spoke, the coffin was placed at the head of the chapel for the duration of the service. After the service, the coffin was placed temporarily in the Albert Memorial Chapel, the smaller chapel adjacent to St. George's that had been built by Victoria as a memorial to Albert in the 1860s. The coffin remained there for 2 days, in the interval that Victoria's instructions had specified, to allow the various foreign visitors to depart, and for the more private final burial to be conducted with only the immediate family present. On the morning of the 4th of February 1901, the coffin was taken from the Albert Memorial Chapel down through the gardens at Frogmore to the mausoleum. The procession was perhaps 20 people, the immediate family, the household, the few servants who had served Victoria along the last years of her life. The coffin was carried by Highland soldiers from the Balmoral estate in the gesture that the instructions had specified Victoria had wanted, in the private way that her affection for Scotland had produced, the men who had served her in the Highlands to be the men who carried her into her tomb. The coffin was lowered into the granite tomb beneath the marble effigies. The lid of the tomb was sealed. The brief private service of committal was conducted by the family chaplain. The family stood for some minutes around the closed tomb where the moment required. Then they withdrew. The doors of the mausoleum were closed. The two of them, Victoria and Albert, were now together in the place that Victoria had been preparing for the two of them throughout the 39 years since his death. She was placed beside Albert. The marble effigies on the tomb above were now matched Albert's effigy, made in 1862 in the year after his death, and Victoria's effigy, made in the same year in advance against this day, lying side by side at the centre of the great mausoleum. The tomb that had been waiting for her for 39 years was now closed. The marriage that had begun on the 10th of February 1840 had now reached its full physical completion on the 4th of February 1901, 61 years, all but 6 days from the wedding to the joint burial. Let me sit with this for a moment, because I think the architecture of what Victoria did with her widowhood deserves a proper consideration. We tend, in the modern reading of her, to register her widowhood as excessive, the 40 years of black, the preserved rooms, the plaster hand, the constant journal entries to a man who had been dead for decades. The whole structure has, to the modern eye, the look of pathology, of a grief so all-consuming that it became a kind of imprisonment, of a mourning so prolonged that it ceased to be mourning and became merely a refusal to live. There is some truth to this reading. The widowhood was, in certain real ways, excessive. It produced bad outcomes for the monarchy as an institution. It produced difficult relationships with her children. It cost her in some measure the second half of her own life. But I want to suggest, as this story permits, that the reading is not the whole reading. What Victoria did with her widowhood was also, in a different light, the working out of an understanding of love that her marriage to Albert had given her. She had loved him without reservation across 21 years. She had built her adult life around him so completely that when he died, the structure of her interior life simply could not accommodate his absence. The 40 years of mourning were not, in this reading, a refusal to live. They were the only way that Victoria knew how to continue living after Albert was gone. The rituals were the architecture that allowed the continuation. The preserved rooms, the plaster hand, the daily journal entries, these were the prosthetic devices that let her go on functioning in a world that no longer contained her husband. This is, in some real sense, the difficulty of any great love. The love is, while it lasts, the source of meaning and joy. The love is also, when it ends, the source of a difficulty that lasts as long as the love did. Victoria's marriage to Albert had been 21 years long. Her widowhood was 40 years long. The love had been intense enough to produce the marriage. The arithmetic of her grief was in this sense not pathological but proportional. It was the expression of a love that had been the central organizing fact of her adult life. This is the part of the Victoria and Albert story that I find most genuinely moving, and that the standard romantic accounts tend to flatten or skip. The love was great enough to produce the marriage, and the love was great enough, after all of that, to produce a 40-year widowhood in which Victoria continued, in the private way that her devotion required, to be married to a man who had died at 42. Let me close by saying a few things about what this story leaves behind, because the legacies of the Victoria and Albert marriage have shaped the world we live in to a degree that is genuinely surprising once you start to notice them. The first legacy is the British monarchy as we know it. Albert's 21 years of work on the role and structure of the monarchy produced, by the time of his death in 1861, the model of constitutional royalty that has shaped the British crown ever since. The separation of the monarchy from active politics. The development of the royal family as a public institution focused on charitable, cultural, and ceremonial work rather than on political power. The representation of national continuity and stability rather than of partisan policy. The image of the monarch as the symbol of the nation rather than as the active ruler of it. All of these elements of the modern British monarchy were, in some real sense, Albert's invention, refined and tested in the working years of his marriage to Victoria, and bequeathed to her successors as the shape of the institution. Edward VII inherited it, George V refined it, the current royal family, in how they perform their public role, are still working within the architecture that Albert designed in the 1840s and 1850s. The monarchy of King Charles is, in some real sense, the monarchy of Albert, 3 generations down the line. The second legacy is the visual and material culture of the white Christian wedding as we know it through the English-speaking world. The white wedding dress, with the lace veil and the orange blossom, Victoria's invention in February of 1840. The wedding ceremony as a private religious occasion rather than as a state spectacle, Victoria's invention. The tradition of the bride wearing white and the groom wearing dark formal clothing, Victoria's invention. the arrangement of the bridesmaids in white dresses to match the bride Victoria's invention. Over the next 2 centuries, every white wedding from Boston to Brisbane has been, in some real sense, a modified copy of what Victoria did at the Chapel Royal at St James's on the 10th of February 1840. The wedding industry that occupies a substantial portion of modern Western consumer culture is at its visual root a Victorian invention shaped by the aesthetic decisions of a 20-year-old bride who wanted to walk down the aisle as a wife rather than as a queen. The third legacy is the modern Western Christmas. Albert's importation of the German Christmas tree, the family Christmas around the tree on Christmas Eve, the gifts placed under the tree, the German ornaments, the candles, the carols sung around the piano in the drawing room, all of this came from Coburg via Albert into the British royal family around the 1840s and from into British middle-class life via the Illustrated London News engraving of 1848, and from British middle-class life into the broader Western Christian world along the second half of the 19th century. The American Christmas as we celebrate it, the Australian Christmas, the Canadian Christmas, the Christmas of any English-speaking household with a tree in the living room. All of it is, in some real sense, Albert's Christmas, exported from the ducal court of Coburg via the working partnership of his marriage, and into the homes of hundreds of millions of people who never heard of Coburg and would not recognize Albert's name. The fourth legacy is the educational and cultural infrastructure of South Kensington in London. The Victoria and Albert Museum, the Science Museum, the Natural History Museum, the Royal Albert Hall, the Royal College of Music, Art, Imperial College, the various other educational institutions that occupy the cluster of buildings between Hyde Park and the Thames. All of these were built throughout the second half of the 19th century, with the funds and the educational vision that came out of the Great Exhibition of 1851. Every visitor to the Victoria and Albert Museum is walking through Albert's legacy. Every concert at the Royal Albert Hall is performed in his memorial. Every student at Imperial College is being educated in an institution that Albert imagined, and Victoria, after his death, completed in his honour. The South Kensington complex is one of the great urban legacies of any 19th century figure. It exists because Albert did the work, and because Victoria, after his death, finished what he had begun. The fifth legacy is more diffuse, but perhaps the most pervasive, the model of the modern royal family as a private domestic unit rather than as a public institution. The image of the monarch and the consort with their children gathered around them in the affectionate way of an ordinary middle-class family. The publication of family photographs, the presentation of the children's lives, the production of the royal family as a family that was relatable to ordinary subjects rather than as a remote court. All of this was Albert's project, refined in the years of his marriage to Victoria, and it has shaped the way every European royal house has presented itself ever since. The royal family Christmas card, the official birthday photographs of the children, the balance between privacy and public availability that the modern royal family attempts to maintain. All of this is, in some real sense, Albert's invention. These are the visible legacies. There is also a less visible legacy that I want to mention, because it is in some ways the most interesting one for the purposes of our story tonight. The Victorian and Albert marriage produced, through the second half of the 19th century, a model of romantic married love that was widely promoted and widely imitated across Western Christian culture. The model was specific. It was monogamous. It was centered on the household. It was sustained over the long working years by mutual respect and mutual collaboration rather than by the dramatic passions of the courtship period. It was, in its self-presentation, a partnership of equals working in their separate spheres for the building up of the family. It was, in some sense, the marriage that Albert had designed in his teenage years to be the redemptive opposite of his parents' marriage, and that he and Victoria had then refined together around the 21 working years of their actual marriage into something like a workable adult model. This model became, along the second half of the 19th century and into the 20th, the dominant cultural image of what a good marriage should look like. The middle-class Victorian marriage as it was celebrated in fiction, in advice literature, in popular illustrations, in the private aspirations of millions of ordinary people throughout the English-speaking world. This was, in some real sense, the Victoria and Albert marriage being modelled, copied, aspired to. The working partnership rather than the romantic dyad, the household as the centre, the children as the focus, the mutual respect of two people who had become, in the years of their marriage, indispensable to each other. Whether this was a good model is a question that can be debated. The Victorian marriage as cultural ideal had its costs. For women who found themselves in marriages that did not in fact work as well as Victoria's had worked, and who were judged by the cultural ideal in ways that were not always fair. The marriage of equals was easier when both partners were, like Victoria and Albert, intelligent and well-educated and committed to the project. It was harder when one or both partners were not. The cultural model was widely imitated. It was not always achieved, and the gap between the imitation and the achievement produced its own 19th century unhappiness, which the literature of its time documents at length. But the model itself in its origins was based on something real. The marriage of Victoria and Albert was, by every piece of surviving evidence, a successful working partnership of two people who had, against the odds of arranged dynastic matches, managed to fall in love and stay in love through the working years of their adult lives. It produced what marriages at their best are supposed to produce: children, work, mutual development, a ground from which both partners did the work of their adult lives. It also produced, when it ended in 1861, the 40-year continuation that Victoria's widowhood made into one of the great romantic monuments of the 19th century. I want to leave you tonight with one final thought about this story, because it is the thought that I keep coming back to whenever I think about Victoria and Albert. Most love stories are, in some sense, about the meeting and the falling in love and the marriage. They end at the wedding or shortly after. The stories that go further than the wedding tend to be tragedies: the love that ends badly, the marriage that fails, the partners who turn against each other. The standard romantic narrative does not have a good way of handling the long successful marriage that simply runs its working course over the years and ends eventually with one partner dying first. The Victoria and Albert story is one of the few in the historical record that gives us a long successful marriage in full detail, with most of the documents preserved, with both partners articulate enough about their feelings to leave us a clear record of what the marriage was like from the inside. It is, in this sense, a kind of historical gift, a chance to see what a great love can become when it is given the working space of decades to develop into the partnership it can be. What I take from it, in my own thinking about love and marriage and long partnership, is the fact that the great love stories are not, in their actual lived experience, mostly about the moments of high drama. They are mostly about the breakfasts, the morning side-by-side work, the afternoon walks, the 1,000 daily contacts that two people who have committed to each other build up around the years into the ground of their shared life. The high drama happens, the proposals, the wedding nights, the deathbed scenes, but the high drama is the visible peaks of a much larger structure that is mostly underwater. The love that lasts is mostly the daily texture, year after year, of two people who have decided to be each other's primary companion along the working years of their adult lives. And what Victoria's widowhood teaches us, perhaps, is that this kind of love does not entirely end when one of the partners dies. The breakfasts are gone, the afternoon walks are gone, but the structure that the years of partnership have built up in the surviving partner remains, in some private way, even after the partner is no longer there to be the other half of it. Victoria's 40 years of widowhood were not, in this reading, a perverse refusal to live. They were the continuation of a love that the marriage had built into the foundations of her interior life, and that the marriage's ending had not, in any decisive way, reached down to dismantle. This is, in some sense, the most hopeful thing I can offer you about this story. The love that is built carefully throughout the years becomes a thing that does not entirely depend on the continuing presence of both partners to continue existing. It becomes part of the surviving partner. It becomes a structure they carry with them through whatever years they have left after the loss. It becomes, in Victoria's case, the architecture of a 40-year widowhood that was in its own way still the same marriage that had begun on the 10th of February 1840 in the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace. The marriage lasted 21 years. The love lasted 61 years. The work that the love produced is still around us, in the museums, in the wedding dresses, in the Christmas trees, in the working architecture of the modern monarchy, and somewhere in the Frogmore Mausoleum, on the hill above the gardens at Windsor, Victoria and Albert, lie side by side under the marble effigies that were made when they were 42 years old, the way they remember each other in the long years between her death and the moment when she joined him there. If you have managed to stay with me to the end of this, I hope the story has been worth the time. The Victoria and Albert marriage is, when you walk through it slowly through how we have done tonight, one of the more humanly affecting stories in the historical record. The two 17-year-olds who barely registered each other in 1836. The same two people at 20, falling in love over 5 days in October of 1839, the wedding at the Chapel Royal in February of 1840, in the white dress that would, by accident of fashion, become the wedding dress of the Western Christian world. The 21 years of working partnership that built the modern monarchy, and the South Kensington museums, and the Christmas tree, and the architecture of the royal family as a private domestic institution. The death of Albert at 42 on the cold December evening at Windsor in 1861, the 40 years of Victoria's continuing devotion, the white dress for the burial, the dressing gown and the plaster hand and the photographs in the coffin, the concealed place in her left hand for John Brown's photograph and lock of hair, hidden by the posy of flowers in the private gesture that Victoria had wanted to make. The two of them now, finally, side by side in the Frogmore tomb, where they have been together for more than 120 years now, and where they will be together, presumably, for as long as the structures of British royal funerary tradition continue to maintain the marble and the granite and the reverence that the place expects. The thing I keep returning to, when I think about the whole arc of it, is the detail of the effigies being made together in 1862. Victoria was 42. Albert was dead. She had her own funeral effigy carved at the same time as his, in the same marble, by the same sculptor, to be placed beside his on the tomb that was being built for both of them. She was, at 42, lying down in advance beside her dead husband. She was already, in the representational way that the marble effigy permitted, where she was going to be. And then she lived for another 39 years, going about her days as the Queen Empress of the largest empire in human history, raising her children and her grandchildren, working through her dispatch boxes, keeping her journal, wearing her black, visiting the mausoleum where her own future tomb waited beside her husband's tomb, with her own marble effigy already in place, lying beside his, as if the burial had already happened and the rest of her life were merely the temporal detail of catching up with the place she had already gone to be. That is the part of the story that I find, when I sit with it long enough, more genuinely moving than any of the other moments. She had decided within months of his death where she was going to be at the end. She had then lived nearly 4 decades of the working life of the British monarchy while waiting to get there. And when she finally got there, on the 4th of February 1901, she joined the marble effigy of herself that had been waiting for her there since 1862, and the long arrangement that her widowhood had been preparing finally came together in the physical fact of 2 coffins in a granite tomb under 2 marble figures at the centre of a cruciform building in the Home Park at Windsor. That is the story. I hope, wherever you are tonight, that some piece of it has settled with you because I have been trying to tell it. Thank you for staying. Sleep well. Until next time.